Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The desert doesn't forgive trespasses. I learned that the hard way, 3 miles from the freight line where the Sonoran wind carries the metallic shriek of cargo trains through midnight air. The detention center crouched in the darkness like something that had learned to hold its breath. 2 stories of corrugated steel and razor wire, abandoned since the policy shifts of 2019, but never quite empty. My camera bag felt heavier than it should as we approached the chain link perimeter, its weight pulling at my shoulder like a hand urging me back. My companions had found the place on an urban exploration forum, one of those threads where people trade coordinates and half warnings. The older one, I'd known him since college, a graphic designer with a taste for decay, had insisted it was safe. The younger one, his cousin visiting from Tucson, just wanted material for his social media. I wanted the photographs, the kind of images that make gallery curators lean forward and ask where you found such desolation. The padlock on the service entrance had been cut months ago, perhaps years. Inside, the air tasted of rust and something else, a staleness that reminded me of holding my breath in a closed room. The designer swept his flashlight across the receiving area, illuminating benches bolted to concrete and a processing window with its glass intact, but hazed with desert dust. Everything was beige and institutional gray, designed to be forgettable. It had succeeded. That's when I felt it first. The weight. Not physical, though it settled on my chest like humidity. More like the atmosphere had thickened, molecules pressing closer together until they formed something watchful. The sensation crawled up my spine and lodged at the base of my skull. My companions didn't seem to notice. They were already moving deeper, their footsteps echoing off walls that swallowed and returned the sound wrong, delayed by half a second, as if the building needed time to decide what to do with noise. The administrative wing stretched ahead, a corridor lined with offices stripped of everything valuable. But value is relative. In the third room, I found filing cabinets with their drawers forced open, folders spilling across the floor. Someone had tried to destroy them. Black streaks of solvent scored across manila covers, reducing names and numbers to chemical smears. But they'd stopped. Or been stopped. Half the folders remained sealed, their labels intact, sorted by month and year. I lifted one. The paper felt wrong beneath my fingers, almost warm, and I set it down quickly. On the wall opposite, a bulletin board displayed rules in English and Spanish. Someone had painted over them with industrial primer, but the effort had been incomplete. Through the white film, I could still read fragments. Compliance is mandatory. No personal items. Detention period indeterminate. The words pulsed at the edge of readability, appearing and disappearing depending on how the flashlight beam struck them. The designer had moved on, but his cousin lingered, running a phone camera over everything. That's when I saw the badge. It had slipped between the filing cabinet and the wall, laminated plastic with a photo and barcode, its lanyard still attached. I reached for it without thinking, my fingers closing around the cool surface. The hum started immediately, low and distant, like standing near high-voltage lines. It originated somewhere behind my left ear, inside my head, but also outside it, resonating in the space between thought and sensation. I dropped the badge. The sound persisted for 3 more seconds, then stopped so abruptly that the silence felt violent. The designer called from deeper in the building, his voice carrying that forced casualness people use when they're unsettled but won't admit it. He'd found the detention blocks, the real meat of the facility, he said, where the cells would make for dramatic shots. The cousin agreed immediately, already moving toward his voice. I picked up the badge again. This time I was ready for the hum, bracing for it. Nothing happened. The plastic sat inert in my palm, its photo showing a man in his 40s with tired eyes and a practiced smile. The name was illegible, scored by the same solvent that had attacked the folders. I slipped it into my jacket pocket, an instinctive theft I couldn't explain. Before following the others, I spoke to the empty room. The words came out before I'd decided to say them, pulled from some vestigial part of my brain that still believed in courtesy toward spaces that demanded respect. "I'm just here to document," I said quietly. "I'll leave everything as I found it. Permission to record and leave." The weight lifted. Not completely. It never would, I understood that now. But enough that breathing became easier. The pressure behind my eyes receded. I felt suddenly, powerfully certain that I'd done something necessary. Something that had been heard. The detention block waited at the end of a connecting hallway, its entrance marked by a sliding door of reinforced mesh. The tracks looked functional despite the abandonment, greased and maintained by forces that had outlasted human presence. Through the mesh, I could see rows of cells on 2 levels, facing each other across a central corridor. Emergency lighting strips ran along the ceiling, their covers yellowed but unbroken. The designer had already entered, his footsteps ringing on the metal stairs that led to the upper tier. His cousin stood at the threshold, filming the cell doors with their observation windows and food slots. I raised my camera, adjusting for the low light. Through the viewfinder, the space looked different, compressed and somehow more present, as if the lens revealed rather than captured. That's when the cousin made his joke. I didn't hear the exact words. Something about the accommodations, a sarcastic comment about government hospitality. His voice carried the performative edge of someone playing to an imaginary audience. The laughter that followed was brief and hollow. Every emergency light in the block activated simultaneously, not a gradual brightening or even the stuttering warmth of fluorescence coming online. They snapped to full brightness in an instant, harsh white light flooding the cells and corridor. But they didn't stay constant. Instead, they began to cycle. On for 2 seconds, off for 3, on for 2, off for 3. The pattern was exact, mechanical. The timing so precise it felt like a heartbeat. No power had reached this facility in years. The designer said so, his voice tight. The backup generators had been stripped during decommissioning. The solar panels on the roof were cracked and useless, visible on satellite images. Yet the lights continued their test sequence, and in the gaps between illumination, the darkness felt calculated. Then came the locks. The cell doors were never meant to be silent. They'd been designed to announce their function, magnetic bolts sliding home with a sharp clack that would remind detainees of their status. Now, without electricity, without any visible cause, they began to activate. One at a time, proceeding down the line. Clack, clack, clack. The sound moved like a thing with intention, working methodically from the far end of the block toward where we stood. The cousin backed away from the door, his phone still recording, but his hands shaking enough that the footage would be worthless. The designer descended the stairs quickly, no longer interested in dramatic angles. I stood paralyzed, watching through my viewfinder as the sequence continued. 12 cells on each side. The bolts engaged on cells 1 through 8, 9, 10. At cell 11, the pattern changed. The door didn't just lock, it slid open. 6 inches, no more. The gap was precise, exactly wide enough to suggest invitation. Through the observation window, I could see the interior, bare concrete and a steel shelf that served as a bed. On the wall, someone had scratched marks. Not the random scratchings of boredom, but organized tallies. Hundreds of them, perhaps thousands. They covered every available surface in neat rows that climbed toward the ceiling and disappeared into shadow. The emergency lights stopped cycling. They held steady on cell 11, leaving the rest of the block in darkness. The invitation was clear. Nobody moved. The silence expanded until it became its own form of pressure, demanding response. My finger found the shutter button. The camera's mechanical click seemed impossibly loud. In that moment, something shifted. The weight returned, but transformed. No longer oppressive, it felt expectant. Waiting. The designer grabbed my arm. His grip was too tight, fingers digging through my jacket. He wanted to leave. Now. Immediately. Retrace our steps, exit through the service entrance, get back to the car before something undefined but certain occurred. His cousin nodded frantically, already moving toward the corridor we'd entered through. But the corridor had changed. Not dramatically. The walls were the same beige concrete, the floor the same polished concrete. Yet it felt longer, the exit farther away, and halfway down, where there had been nothing but blank wall, a junction now branched left. A corridor that hadn't existed during our entry, or that I hadn't noticed, or that the building had decided to reveal only now. A sign hung above the junction, one of those industrial placards with reflective lettering. Authorized personnel only. Follow procedure. 7B for entry. In smaller text below, non-compliance subject to detention. The designer started toward the original exit, ignoring the junction. After 3 steps, he stopped. The air ahead looked wrong, wavering like heat shimmer, though the temperature remained cool. He extended a hand. His fingers met resistance where none should exist, pressing against invisible barrier. He pushed harder. The air pushed back. His cousin tried next, then me. The boundary was absolute but sourceless. We could see the exit clearly, could map the path back to the service entrance, but the building had decided that path was closed. The only option was the new corridor, the junction marked by procedure and authorization. Something in my pocket vibrated. The badge. I pulled it out. The laminated plastic was warm now, almost hot, and the photo had changed. Not dramatically, the same man, the same tired eyes, but his expression had shifted. He was looking directly at the camera now, at me, and his practiced smile had flattened into something that wasn't quite a smile anymore, more like anticipation. The designer asked what we should do, his voice rising toward panic. I heard myself answer, the words arriving before conscious thought could examine them. We follow the procedures. We comply with the signs. We treat this place the way it demands to be treated, because the alternative is worse. The cousin protested. What procedures? We weren't authorized. We'd broken in, for fuck's sake. We had no business following the protocols of an abandoned detention center. The building didn't care what we... The emergency lights in cell 11 flickered. 3 times. Fast. Like Morse code for distress. Or warning. I started walking toward the junction, not from courage, but from certainty that resistance would fail. The building had established its rules with perfect clarity. Comply or remain. Follow procedure or face detention. The irony wasn't lost on me. We'd entered as trespassers and found ourselves trapped in the same bureaucratic logic that had once confined others. The new corridor descended, gradually at first, then more steeply, angling down toward levels that shouldn't exist in a 2-story facility. The walls here showed signs of different construction, older concrete, darker stains, ventilation grates with rust patterns that looked almost decorative. Doors appeared at regular intervals, each marked with numbers and letter combinations. 7A, 7B, 7C. The placards reflected our flashlight beams too brightly, almost aggressively, demanding to be read. At 7B, I stopped. The door was steel, industrial, with a magnetic card reader that showed a steady green light despite the absence of power. The badge in my pocket had become uncomfortable, its heat increasing until it felt like holding something living. I pulled it out. The barcode on the back was moving, or appeared to move, the black lines shifting and reforming into patterns that might have been numbers, or might have been something else entirely. The designer stood close behind me, his breathing shallow. He wanted to know what was behind the door, what procedure 7B entailed, why the building had guided us here specifically. I had no answers. Only intuition, that same vestigial instinct that had prompted me to ask permission in the administrative wing. I held the badge up to the reader. The door unlocked with a hydraulic hiss, releasing air that smelled of ozone and old paper. Beyond lay a room that defied the detention center's architectural logic. It wasn't a cell or an office. It was a monitoring station. Multiple screens mounted on walls, each one displaying different corridors and rooms within the facility. But the images weren't static. They moved. Figures walked through frames, crossing from one screen to another with purpose. Men and women in civilian clothes carrying belongings, following painted lines on floors. Detainees, but not past detainees. The timestamps in the corners read, current dates, current times. We weren't alone in the building. Except we were. I knew we were. We'd checked every corridor, every room. The facility was empty of human presence beyond our three-person group. Yet the screens insisted otherwise, showing dozens of people moving through detention procedures, being processed, documented, contained. The designer reached toward one screen as if to touch it, then pulled back. His hand was shaking. The cousin noticed something else. In the corner of the room, a terminal glowed with amber text. A log of entries, dates, and times stretching back years. The most recent entry was time-stamped 17 minutes ago. It read, 3 unauthorized entries. Detention protocol initiated. Reclassification pending. Below that, 3 profiles. Names redacted, replaced by numbers. But each profile included a photograph. The designer, his cousin, me. Captured at unknown moments during our exploration. Our faces blank with the same expression worn by everyone else processed through this facility. Resignation masquerading as patience. The screens began to change. The figures disappeared, winking out of existence one by one until only empty corridors remained. Empty except for 3 moving shapes, visible in the feeds from Detention Block B. Us. We were on the screens now, displayed from angles that showed no cameras, recorded by systems that shouldn't function. And in the feed showing the monitoring room, showing the space we currently occupied, 3 figures stood exactly where we stood, looking at screens that showed those same figures in infinite recursion. The designer broke first. He lunged for the door we'd entered through, the one that had admitted us to this impossible room. It opened easily. The corridor beyond was different. Not the descending passage we'd followed, but a horizontal hallway lined with doors marked with sequential numbers. Detention Block C. None of us moved. The building had rerouted our exit, changing the geography to suit its purposes. In my pocket, the badge pulsed with heat one final time, then cooled. I pulled it out. The photo had reverted to its original state. The tired man with his practiced smile, looking past the camera towards something only he could see. But on the back, beneath the barcode, new text had appeared in precise bureaucratic font. Compliance verified. Detention period indeterminate. Thank you for your cooperation. The cousin asked if we were trapped, if the building would ever let us leave. I wanted to answer yes or no, to provide certainty in either direction. Instead, I told him what I'd come to understand in that monitoring room, watching our images multiply across impossible screens. The building didn't distinguish between authorized and unauthorized, between staff and detained, between visitor and trespasser. It recognized only procedure. And once you entered procedure, once you allowed the building to process you through its systems, you became part of its function. The designer said we should refuse. Just walk back, ignore the signs, break through whatever barriers appeared. Force our way out through sheer will. I asked him to try. He moved toward the corridor we'd entered from. The air shimmered again. The barrier held. He pushed harder, then started hitting it, palms slapping against nothing. The sound echoed wrong, absorbed rather than reflected. Above us, the emergency lights began cycling again. 2 seconds on, 3 seconds off. The pattern was familiar now, almost comforting. In the darkness between illuminations, I thought I saw other shapes in the corridor. People standing in doorways, watching our attempts with patient recognition. They'd tried too. They'd failed too. Now they waited, following procedures that had no endpoint, trapped in bureaucratic logic that outlasted reason. I don't know how long we stayed in that monitoring room. Time felt negotiable, elastic. The screens continued their display, showing corridors that branched into other corridors, rooms that opened onto duplicate rooms, a facility that extended far beyond its physical footprint. Somewhere in that maze, the exit existed, the service entrance we'd used to enter. But finding it required following the correct procedure, navigating by rules we hadn't been taught. The badge felt heavier in my pocket now, its weight familiar, like something I'd carried for years. My camera hung unused around my neck. I hadn't taken a photograph since cell 11. Didn't need to. The images had already been captured, logged, processed. We were all on record now. Eventually, we started walking. Not back toward where we'd entered. That route had proven impassable. Forward, deeper into the facility's lower levels, following the lit corridors when they appeared, stopping at each junction to read the procedural signs. We became careful, methodical, asking permission at doorways, announcing our intention to comply. The building rewarded cooperation, doors unlocked, barriers dissolved. New corridors revealed themselves, but we never found the exit. Or perhaps we did, but couldn't recognize it. After hours, or days, time had stopped registering in any reliable way. The corridors began to repeat. We'd passed the same cell blocks, the same administrative wings, walking in loops that felt like progress, but returned us to identical starting points. The designer suggested we were being played with. His cousin thought we'd died somewhere back in the detention block, that this was some kind of bureaucratic afterlife. I didn't speculate. Speculation required hope. The screens in the monitoring room, we returned there periodically, drawn by familiarity, now showed hundreds of figures moving through the facility. Some I recognized from earlier passages. Others were new, or newly visible. All of them followed procedures, lined up at processing windows, stood for photographs that erased their names, entered cells that locked behind them. None of them looked distressed. That was the worst part. They looked adjusted, compliant, like they'd learned the futility of resistance and found peace in submission. I check my pocket now, feeling the badge's constant warmth. The photo has changed again, though I can't remember when I last looked at it. The man's face is harder to see, features blurred by time or memory, but his eyes remain clear. Tired, infinitely tired. I wonder if I look like that now, if my companions do. The designer and his cousin stopped talking hours ago, or days. We walk in silence, following signs, obeying protocols. Sometimes we encounter others doing the same. Figures who appear in corridors and disappear into cells, their faces blank with patience. We don't interact. Interaction isn't part of any procedure we've found. The building never stops. Its systems cycle perpetually. Lights testing, locks engaging, doors sliding open and closed. Somewhere in its depths, machinery runs on power that shouldn't exist, maintaining functions that serve purposes nobody remembers. We've become part of that function. Processed, documented, detained. I think about the outside world sometimes. The desert night we left behind. The car parked on the shoulder 3 miles from the freight line. People will wonder where we went. They'll search the detention center eventually, find no trace. The building is good at keeping its processes internal, at containing what it captures. The worst part isn't the confinement, it's the acceptance. How quickly we adapted to the rules. How natural it feels now to ask permission, to follow posted procedures, to check badges and read signs. The building didn't break us. It simply revealed what we'd always been. Compliant creatures who need structure, even when that structure becomes its own purpose. Tonight, or what I call tonight, measuring time by the emergency light cycles, we walked past the monitoring room again. The screen showed 3 figures in detention block B, standing where we'd stood weeks or months ago, watching locks engage and doors slide open. New arrivals, new unauthorized entries. The building will process them too. Initiate detention protocols. Reclassify their status from trespasser to detained. I wanted to warn them, to shout through whatever barrier separates the recorded from the real. But I don't know which side of that barrier I'm on anymore. Don't know if I'm watching their entry or they're watching my detention. Don't know if the building distinguishes between observation and experience. The badge in my pocket pulses with familiar warmth. The photo has finally changed completely. Now it shows me. My face, my tired eyes, my expression that isn't quite a smile. Below it, new text has appeared. Detention period indeterminate. Thank you for your compliance. I understand now. We were never trespassers. We were always meant to be processed. The building doesn't make mistakes. It follows procedure perfectly, eternally, waiting for those who enter without authorization so it can grant them permanent authority. authority to remain, to comply, to become part of its endless function. The designer and his cousin walk ahead of me down another identical corridor. We follow the signs like we always do, like we always will. The building's mercy is absolute. It never releases what it properly contains. And somewhere in the administrative wing, in a room full of forced filing cabinets and solvent-scored folders, another badge has appeared on the floor, waiting for the next photographer who thinks he's come to document decay. Who doesn't understand that some places do the documenting themselves. Some places have perfect memories. They never forget names, even when those names become numbers, become entries in logs that never end. The emergency lights cycle overhead. 2 seconds on, 3 seconds off. The pattern is comfort now. The pattern is all we have. The building breathes, and we breathe with it, following procedures that lead nowhere but deeper into procedure itself. I wonder if anyone will find my photographs, the images I didn't take, the ones the building captured instead, filing us away in its perfect system. Maybe one day someone will look at those screens in the monitoring room and see us walking, eternally walking, following signs that promise exit but deliver only continuation. Or maybe we're already there, already on the screens, already processed. And everything since, the corridors, the searching, the hope, has been the detention period itself. Indeterminate. As promised. The building keeps its promises. That's what makes compliance so necessary, so inevitable. We turn another corner, reading another sign, following another procedure. The corridor ahead looks exactly like every corridor behind us. This is what forever looks like, I think. Not dramatic, not even cruel, just methodical, just procedural, just a building doing what buildings do when they're designed to contain, and nothing teaches them to stop. The badge grows warmer in my pocket, confirming my compliance. Above us, the lights cycle on. The building approves. The building always approves of those who follow procedure. 2 seconds on, 3 seconds off. On, off, on, off. We walk. Story 2. The headlights carved through the South Dakota darkness, like a surgeon's scalpel through diseased tissue. 4 hours of gravel roads had left my teeth aching from the constant rattle, dust coating my throat until every swallow felt like sandpaper. The other 4 passengers had grown quiet miles ago, their earlier enthusiasm for this midnight detour reduced to occasional sighs and the rustle of someone shifting position in the cramped sedan. I'd been the one to suggest it. The junkyard squatted 3 miles off Highway 44, according to the bartender back in Kadoka, who'd drawn us a map on a cocktail napkin with shaking hands. He'd warned us the place had a reputation, though he wouldn't elaborate beyond muttering something about the previous owner and unfinished business. The way his eyes had darted to the door when he said it made the hair on my neck stand up in a way I'd found oddly thrilling. We were looking for a thrill after all. 4 strangers thrown together by a conference in Rapid City, bonded only by our mutual boredom and a shared appetite for the morbid. When I'd proposed exploring something genuinely unsettling, they'd agreed with the kind of nervous laughter that masks genuine interest. The junkyard announced itself not with a sign, but with a smell. Rust and motor oil and something else. Something organic and wrong that reminded me of the time a raccoon had died in my childhood home's crawl space. The fence materialized from the darkness gradually. Chain link turned orange by oxidation, sagging in places like exhausted shoulders. No gate barred our entrance, just an opening where the fence had been peeled back like the lid of a sardine can. I killed the engine. In the sudden silence, the cooling metal of the hood ticked like a countdown. The woman in the passenger seat, a software engineer from Minneapolis whose name I'd already half forgotten, cleared her throat. She suggested maybe we'd come far enough, that we'd gotten our adventure just by finding the place. But I was already opening my door, the interior light flooding the car with a jaundiced glow that made us all look sick. The gravel crunched beneath my feet with a sound like breaking teeth. I grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight from the trunk, its weight reassuring in my palm. The others followed reluctantly, their phone screens casting competing pools of blue-white light that seemed to die within feet of their sources, swallowed by a darkness that felt more substantial than mere absence of light. I remember standing there, at the mouth of that mechanical graveyard, and feeling something shift in the air. Not a breeze, but a change in pressure, like the moment before thunder. I said the words without really thinking about them, projecting my voice into that wall of dark. Give us a real scare. The others laughed, but it was the wrong kind of laughter, brittle and forced. One of them, a man who'd spent the drive complaining about his ex-wife, asked if I was trying to summon something. I'd meant it as a joke, as bravado, but the words had left my mouth with more weight than I'd intended, as if something in the junkyard had given them substance. We moved deeper into the maze of twisted metal. Rows of gutted cars stretched in every direction, their empty windows like the eye sockets of skulls. Engine blocks sat in pools of decades-old oil. A school bus, its yellow paint blistered and peeling, leaned at an angle that defied physics, supported by nothing visible. Towers of compressed vehicle cubes created a skyline against the stars, geometric and impossible. The beam of my flashlight caught something moving. I stopped walking so abruptly that the person behind me collided with my back. There, centered perfectly in the circle of light maybe 30 yards ahead, sat a cat, black as the spaces between stars, motionless except for its tail, which twitched back and forth with metronomic precision. Left, right, left, right. Its eyes reflected my light as twin coins of green fire. Someone whispered that we should leave, but I was transfixed by that cat, by the wrongness of its absolute stillness everywhere except that hypnotic tail. How long we stood watching it, I couldn't say. Time had become elastic, stretching and compressing without pattern. Then I noticed the second set of eyes. They were higher up, positioned behind a tilted pyramid of car hoods, and they glowed not green but red-pink, the color of a match striking in darkness. I swept my light toward them and caught a glimpse of pale fur, nearly white, and the lean silhouette of a coyote. But coyotes aren't white. The bartender's words came back to me. Albino, he'd said, though I didn't remember him saying anything about animals at all. The coyote didn't move. Neither did the cat. They simply watched us, and in their watching, I felt the weight of attention that went beyond animal curiosity. They were too still, too deliberate in their placement, like chess pieces arranged by an unseen player. The software engineer grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to hurt. She pointed to our left, where a collapsed mobile home lay on its side, its aluminum siding shredded to reveal the skeleton of 2x4s beneath. Something was moving there, emerging from the shadows between torn tarps and insulation that hung like entrails. My light found it just as it found us. I've spent the week since trying to describe what I saw, and I've failed every time. The closest I can come is this. Imagine the space where a face should be, a canvas of skin or something like skin, stretched smooth and featureless as an egg. No eyes, no mouth, no nose. Just a white oval the size of a human head, catching my flashlight beam and throwing it back with a dull, organic sheen. It moved with a liquid quality, as if underwater or in a dream, rotating slowly in our direction. Then it noticed the light. I know this with an absolute certainty I can't explain, because it had no eyes to notice with. But something about its posture changed, a subtle shift in the way it held its blank space of a head, and it withdrew. Not quickly. That might have been less terrible. Instead, it pulled back into the darkness with deliberate care, like someone closing a curtain, until the shadows swallowed it completely. My lungs remembered how to work, and I sucked in air that tasted of rust and decay. Behind me, someone was crying, soft little gasps that might have been laughter if not for the edge of hysteria in them. The cat and the coyote were gone, vanished without a sound, but their absence felt more like a repositioning than a departure. That's when the metal started singing. It began as a rhythmic creaking, somewhere deeper in the junkyard's maze. A metallic groan that came in regular intervals, like someone turning a crank or working a hand pump. Creak, pause, mechanical and patient and somehow purposeful. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing off the stacked cars and crushed frames until determining its source became impossible. We should have run. Every primal instinct I possessed was screaming at me to return to the car, to put as much distance between myself and this place as the night would allow. But there's something in the human psyche that refuses to flee without understanding. That needs to know what's hunting it. So we moved toward the sound. The junkyard's geography made no sense. Paths we'd walked minutes before seemed to have rearranged themselves. A row of pickup trucks that should have been on our right was suddenly ahead of us. A crane I didn't remember seeing loomed against the stars, its hook swaying gently despite the absence of wind. The ex-husband stopped at what looked like an industrial cage, maybe 6 feet on each side, its bars thick as a man's thumb. The door hung open, and its latch, a heavy iron mechanism crusted with rust, protested when he touched it. The sound it made reverberated through the junkyard like a gong, impossibly loud, and I swear I felt the vibration in my chest like a second heartbeat. The cranking sound stopped. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own pulse in my ears, a desperate drum that seemed to call attention to our presence. We waited, frozen, for something to respond to the noise we'd made. Nothing moved in the visible sections of the junkyard, but I had the overwhelming sensation of being surrounded, of eyes we couldn't see tracking our every breath. The software engineer's phone buzzed, and we all jumped. She looked at the screen, her face going pale in its glow. She said she had no signal, hadn't had one since we'd entered the junkyard, so her phone shouldn't be receiving anything. But there on her screen was a message, just 2 words in an unknown sender's text: fair trade. Something metal fell with a crash that seemed to come from directly behind us, but when we spun around, nothing had moved. Or if it had already returned to stillness. The towers of compressed cars looked exactly as they had before, but I couldn't shake the feeling that their arrangement was slightly different, as if the entire junkyard was reconfiguring itself around us like a maze that wanted to be unsolvable. We ran then, finally letting panic override curiosity, but the paths we'd used to enter refused to lead us out. Dead ends appeared where none had existed. We'd round a corner and find ourselves facing a wall of stacked vehicles, or a pit filled with twisted axles and serpentine radiator hoses that writhed in our flashlight beams, with a movement that couldn't be explained by rats or wind. I don't know how long we searched for the exit. My phone's time display kept flickering between numbers that made no sense. 2:47 a.m., then 11:03 p.m., then 4:15 a.m., as if time itself had become unreliable. The others were barely holding together, their breathing ragged with exhaustion and fear. Then we found the opening in the fence, the gap we'd driven through. The car sat exactly where we'd left it, patient and waiting, its silver paint dulled by dust but otherwise unchanged. The sight of it, so mundane and normal, nearly broke me with relief. But as I reached for the driver's door handle, I saw something that turned my relief to ice. In the dust that coated the windshield, something, had drawn symbols. Not random scratches, but deliberate patterns that spiraled and intersected with geometric precision. They covered the entire glass surface, complex and purposeful, and they definitely hadn't been there when we'd arrived. The ex-husband pointed out that we'd been inside the junkyard for less than 20 minutes according to the car's dashboard clock, though it felt like hours had passed. He said it with a laugh that held no humor, a sound on the edge of breaking. We drove away, none of us speaking, the symbols on the windshield catching the headlights of every oncoming vehicle like a coded message meant for someone else. The gravel road stretched before us, familiar and yet somehow wrong, as if we were traveling a route that looked like the way we'd come but wasn't quite the same. That's when we saw the elk. It stood in the middle of the road, massive and impossible to miss, antlers spreading like lightning frozen in bone. But it wasn't facing away from us, startled by our approach. It was facing our direction, positioned as if it had been waiting for us, as if it knew exactly when we would arrive and had planted itself deliberately in our path. I slowed the car to a crawl, then stopped entirely when it became clear the elk had no intention of moving. We sat there in a standoff with this creature that shouldn't have been there, that should have bolted at our approach. but instead watched us with an intelligence in its eyes that no animal should possess. The software engineer started laughing, a sound that quickly became indistinguishable from sobbing. She said we'd asked for a scare, hadn't we? We'd asked for it, and something in that junkyard had heard us, had accepted the request like a contract. The elk took one step forward, then another, approaching the car with the deliberate pace of someone making a point. When it reached the hood, it lowered its massive head until its eyes were level with the windshield, with those symbols drawn in the dust. It studied them for a long moment, its breath fogging the glass. Then it lifted its head and looked directly at me through the windshield. In its eyes, I saw something that wasn't elk, something that was using the animal the way a person might use a glove. It tilted its head slightly, as if considering us, as if measuring something about us that I couldn't name. Finally, it stepped aside, moving with a fluid grace to the shoulder of the road. It didn't leave. It simply stood there, watching, as I pressed the accelerator and we rolled forward. I watched it in the rearview mirror until the darkness swallowed it, but I never saw it move again. It just stood there in the middle of that empty road, a sentinel marking our passage. We made it back to the highway. We made it back to Rapid City. We went our separate ways the next morning, exchanging phone numbers we'd never call and email addresses we'd never use. Because what would we say? What could we possibly discuss? I've tried to rationalize it in the weeks since. Mass hysteria, I tell myself. Exhaustion and suggestion and the power of expectation creating experiences from nothing. The elk was just an elk. The cat and coyote were just animals. The thing with no face was a trick of shadow and fear-heightened imagination. But every night when I close my eyes, I see those symbols from the windshield. I've tried to remember their exact patterns, to draw them from memory, but they slip away like water through fingers. All I'm left with is the certainty that they meant something, that they were some kind of receipt or mark or label. The junkyard has rules of exchange, the bartender had said, or maybe I'd thought it, or maybe something else had placed the knowledge directly into my mind. You look, and it looks back. You ask for something, and something answers. Fair trade, the message on the phone had said. I keep wondering what we gave in exchange for our scare. What did we leave behind in that maze of rusted metal and watching eyes? What did we trade without knowing we were making a deal? Sometimes in my peripheral vision, I catch glimpses of things that shouldn't be there. A black cat sitting on a fence that vanishes when I turn my head. A pale shape in the crowd that moves differently than the people around it. The reflection of something watching from windows when I should be seeing only myself. And sometimes late at night, I hear a rhythmic creaking, metal groaning in a patient, purposeful rhythm. Creak, pause, like someone turning a crank in the darkness, like machinery preparing for work that isn't finished. The junkyard let us leave, but I'm beginning to understand that leaving a place and being released from it aren't the same thing at all. You look, and it looks back. I'm starting to think it never stopped looking. Story 3. The rust came first, not the sight of it, but the smell. Metallic and organic, like old blood mixed with something that had been breathing in the dark too long. I'd smelled it the moment I ducked through the chain link gap at the perimeter of the Blackwell thermoelectric complex, but I'd convinced myself it was just oxidation. Just decades of Pennsylvania rain working through abandoned steel. Urban explorers learned to lie to themselves. It's the only way to keep moving forward into places that stopped wanting visitors a long time ago. The complex sprawled across 40 acres of forgotten industrial wasteland, its cooling towers reaching up like concrete fingers that had been trying to claw their way out of the earth before rigor mortis set in. I'd been tracking it for months, ever since I'd found the blueprints in a decommissioned county archive. The main turbine hall. The control room with its analog gauges still frozen at the moment of shutdown. The maze of tunnels connecting the boiler system to the old coal feeders. But what had really drawn me here was the reservoir system. A network of holding tanks and cisterns built 3 stories deep, designed to store the massive quantities of water needed to keep the generators cool. Most urban exploration is disappointment. Spray paint over history, copper stripped by scrappers, nothing left but concrete shells and the ghosts of industry. But sometimes, if you go deep enough, you find the places that were sealed off and forgotten, the places that still held their breath. I was 3 hours into the complex when I found the access corridor. The late afternoon sun angled through the broken windows of the auxiliary building, casting ladder shadows across walls where safety posters from 1987 still warned about proper lockout procedures. The door to the reservoir level had been welded shut at some point, but time and corrosion had done what I couldn't. Peeled back one corner just enough for someone my size to slip through. The stairs down spiraled in darkness. My flashlight beam barely touched the walls before being swallowed by something thicker than shadow. The temperature dropped with each step, and that rust smell intensified, mixed now with something else. Standing water, mildew, and underneath it all, a sweetness that made my throat tighten. I should have turned back. I'd broken my own primary rule: never descend alone into unmapped spaces. But there's a gravity to abandoned places, a pull that has nothing to do with physics. The deeper you go, the harder it becomes to surface. Your curiosity starts to feel like obligation, like you owe something to the darkness for letting you come this far. The reservoir floor was a cathedral of rust. My boots crunched on flaked metal as I swept the flashlight across cylindrical walls that rose 30 feet to a ceiling punctured with access hatches and pipe penetrations. The main holding tank, according to the blueprints I'd memorized, was a double-level system. The upper reservoir where I stood had been designed to feed the lower chamber through a series of grated drains. The grates were still there, geometric patterns of corrosion forming circular mandals in the floor. I was crossing toward the far wall, where I could see the outline of another door, when the floor made a sound like a sigh. That's the only way I can describe it. Not a crack or a groan, but something almost organic, almost relieved. The corroded panel beneath my right foot simply stopped existing, and I was falling. Time stretched. My flashlight spun away, its beam carving wild geometry through the darkness. My shoulder hit something, a steel ledge, maybe one of the maintenance platforms marked on the blueprints, and I grabbed it on instinct, my fingers closing on rust that felt too warm, too soft. My body swung, momentum carrying me over the edge, and I dropped again. This time I landed. The impact drove the air from my lungs and sent lightning through my right knee. I rolled onto my back on cold, damp concrete, gasping, waiting for my vision to clear. When it did, I found myself staring up at a circle of lesser darkness, the hole I'd fallen through, maybe 15 feet above. Not impossible to climb if I had rope, if my knee wasn't already swelling, if I had any idea where my flashlight had landed. I lay there, breathing, taking inventory, phone in my left pocket. I pulled it out, knowing what I'd find. No signal. The reservoir walls were too thick, too deep. No one knew I was here. I'd parked 3 miles away and hiked in through state forest land, leaving no trace, no trail. That was the whole point. My eyes adjusted slowly. There was light, dim and gray, filtering down through ventilation grates in the ceiling, the same ceiling that was the floor I'd just fallen through. I could see the outline of the space around me now. I wasn't in the lower reservoir chamber, not exactly. I was on an intermediate platform, a maintenance level that the blueprints had marked, but I'd dismissed as inaccessible. Below me, maybe another 10 or 12 feet down, I could make out the darker shadow of the main floor. That's when I heard the water. Drip. Long pause. Drip. Drip. Pause. Drip. It wasn't random. The pattern repeated, consistent as a heartbeat. 4 drops, then silence, then the sequence again. I turned my head, trying to locate the source, but sound moved strangely down here. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off steel and concrete until it felt like the walls themselves were counting. I tested my knee. Pain, sharp and immediate, but I could put weight on it. I hauled myself up using a railing that materialized from the gloom, corroded pipe, waist high, running along what appeared to be a catwalk. My phone's flashlight was weak, designed for reading restaurant menus, not navigating industrial tombs, but it was what I had. I swept it across my surroundings. The platform was narrow, maybe 4 feet wide, running along the curved wall of the reservoir. Every 10 feet or so, a steel stanchion rose from the edge, safety posts where chains or rails had once been mounted. Now they stood like lonely sentinels, their tops bent at angles that made them look almost attentive, like they were watching something below. The floor beneath the catwalk was still there. I could see it in the phone's weak glow, but it was dark. Darker than it should have been. The kind of dark that suggested depth, or water, or something else that swallowed light. Drip, 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 drip. The pattern continued. I started moving along the catwalk, one hand on the wall, testing each step before committing my weight. The concrete under my palm was cold and weeping with condensation. Or maybe it wasn't condensation. Maybe it was something else that ran down these walls in the dark. I'd been walking for what felt like 5 minutes when I realized the catwalk was circular. I'd seen that stanchion before. The one with the top bent at exactly that angle, like a finger pointing at something in the darkness below. I'd walked a complete circuit and ended up exactly where I'd started. My breath caught. That wasn't possible. The platform couldn't be that small. I'd been moving at a normal pace, and a circle that took 5 minutes to walk would have a circumference of, 500 feet? 600? This chamber wasn't that large. According to the blueprints, the intermediate level was supposed to connect to a ladder shaft, a series of equipment bays, an emergency exit to the surface. There were supposed to be options, but there was only the circle, only the catwalk, only the counting water and the dark. I checked my phone. 6:47 p.m. The battery icon showed 73%. If I was careful, if I didn't waste it, I could make it last until dawn. Someone would find me by dawn. The complex was scheduled for demolition in 3 weeks. I'd seen the permits. Surely someone would do a final inspection. Surely someone would hear me if I shouted. I decided to save the battery. I'd use the phone light only when necessary. The gray light from above was enough to see the basic outline of things. I could wait. I could be patient. That's when the air moved. Not wind. Not a draft. Something more deliberate, more purposeful. It rose from below, from that dark floor I couldn't quite see. And it carried with it the smell I'd noticed on the surface, but stronger now. Concentrated. Rust and sweetness and something underneath that made my hindbrain scream warnings my conscious mind couldn't quite process. The air passed over me, cold and searching, and continued upward. I listened to it go, heard it whistle through the grates above, through the hole I'd fallen through, going somewhere, looking for something. Then silence. Then, after exactly 5 seconds, it came back. Descending, taking the same path in reverse, pouring down through the hole, spreading across the catwalk, seeking the lower dark again. Drip, 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 drip. I pressed my back against the wall. My knee throbbed. The phone in my hand felt heavier than it should, like it was trying to pull itself toward the floor, toward whatever was down there in that darkness that the gray light wouldn't touch. 7 o'clock. 8 o'clock. The light above faded from gray to black, and I was alone with the counting water and the breathing air. I sat with my back against the wall, phone dark in my pocket, conserving battery, conserving hope. Every 20 minutes, I counted, the air would rise and fall, searching, always searching, and I would sit very still and pray it was looking for something else. At some point, I must have dozed. When I jerked awake, my neck stiff and aching, something had changed. The darkness was different, thicker, and there was light below, not gray light, not the weak amber of sodium lamps filtering through distant grates, but something else, something blue-white and flickering, like an old fluorescent tube coming to life after years of sleep. I didn't want to look. Every instinct I had screamed at me to keep my eyes closed, to sit very still, to let whatever was happening happen without acknowledging it. But instinct is just one voice in a committee, and curiosity, that gravity that had pulled me down here in the first place, was shouting louder. I opened my eyes and looked down. The lower floor wasn't empty, it was full. Not with water, but with light, with movement, with shapes that suggested human workers moving through their routines, checking gauges, adjusting valves, calling out to each other in voices too distant to hear, but close enough to feel as vibrations in the steel. I watched a figure climb a ladder that wasn't there. I watched another kneel beside a pipe joint, working on it with tools that left no reflection, cast no shadow. They were maintenance ghosts, echoes of the workers who had once kept this place running. Their routines burned so deep into the fabric of the complex that they kept playing even after the projector had been turned off, even after the screen had rusted away, and they were counting, all of them, their movements synchronized to the rhythm of the water, to that 4-drop pattern that hadn't stopped since I'd fallen. Drip, 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 step, turn, reach, check. Over and over, the same sequence, the same ritual, bound to this place by repetition and rust and something else that had nothing to do with physics or ghosts, or any explanation that would sound sane in daylight. One of the figures stopped working. It stood very still, too still, the way people don't stand, the way people can't stand without falling. Its head began to turn, slowly, steadily, searching. The air rose from below, cold and purposeful. The same air I'd felt before, but now I could see what it was carrying. Attention, awareness, the accumulated consciousness of 10,000 shifts. 10,000 workers doing the same tasks in the same spaces until their awareness had worn grooves in reality itself. And now that awareness was looking for something, someone, an irregularity, a foreign object in the system, me. I closed my eyes. I pressed myself against the wall so hard I could feel the concrete's texture through my jacket. I held my breath and counted 1, 2, 3, 4, matching my heartbeat to the water, trying to fit myself into the pattern, trying to become part of the routine, just another element of the system, nothing worth investigating, nothing that needed to be corrected or removed or absorbed into the eternal maintenance shift. The air passed over me, paused. I could feel it testing my edges, measuring my heat, determining my status. Foreign object or acceptable deviation, contamination or component. Drip, 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 drip. The air moved on, continued upward, and the light below began to fade. The phantom workers returning to whatever darkness had birthed them. Their counting ritual complete for now, their attention sliding away from my intrusion like water finding its level. I waited until I couldn't feel the air anymore. Then I waited longer. Then I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and checked the time. 3:42 a.m. Battery at 41%. I did the math. Dawn at 6:30, maybe 6:45. I could make it. I had to make it. I kept the phone dark. The gray light hadn't completely vanished. There was still enough filtering down from somewhere to see the outline of the catwalk, the curve of the wall. Enough to know I was still alone on this platform, still trapped in this circle, still counting the water drops and waiting for the air to decide I didn't belong. The next 2 hours were the longest of my life. I forced myself to stay awake, to keep my mind sharp and present, because I knew if I slipped back into sleep, I might see those workers again, and this time, they might see me back. The counting continued. The air rose and fell. My knee swelled until I could barely bend it, and slowly, incrementally, the quality of darkness above began to change. First it went from black to charcoal, then charcoal to slate. Then, and this was when I knew I was going to survive this, when I knew morning was real and coming, slate to iron gray, the color of industrial dawn, the color of shift change and time clocks and the world returning to its ordinary rhythms. Light brought sound. Distant at first, like the phantom workers below, but growing clearer. Traffic on a road I couldn't see, maybe the state route that ran 2 miles south of the complex. A dog barking. And then, at 6:52 a.m., according to my phone, the sound I'd been praying for, sirens. Multiple sirens converging on the complex, close enough that I could distinguish tones, fire truck, ambulance, police. Had someone reported my car? Had a morning jogger spotted the gap in the fence? I didn't care about the how. I cared about the now. I stood on shaking legs and started shouting. My voice echoed off the walls, distorted by concrete and rust into something that sounded desperate and mad and entirely human. I shouted until my throat burned, until I tasted blood, and I kept shouting because those sirens were the only proof I had that the world outside still existed, that there was still a surface to return to. The sirens got louder. Doors slammed. I heard voices. Real voices. Not the whisper memories of workers who couldn't stop their shift, calling to each other, coordinating, searching. I shouted again, and this time a voice answered. Distant but clear, filtering down through the grates and the hole I'd fallen through. Hold on, we're coming. The next hour blurred. A fire crew rigged a rope system. 2 firefighters descended through the hole, their helmet lamps cutting through the gray dawn light like accusations. They found me on the catwalk, my knee swollen to twice its normal size, my voice nearly gone, my phone dead at 37% because in my panic I'd kept turning on the light to make sure the workers below stayed gone. They helped me into a harness. They hauled me up. I emerged into the upper reservoir level, into the same space I'd entered the previous afternoon, only now it looked different. Smaller, more ordinary, just a rust-stained cylinder with a corroded floor, nothing supernatural about it, nothing that couldn't be explained by structural failure and poor maintenance, except for the counting. As they loaded me into the ambulance, as the EMT examined my knee and asked questions about head trauma and loss of consciousness, I could still hear it, faint but persistent, carried on the morning air through the open doors of the ambulance. Drip, 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 drip. Do you hear that? I asked the EMT. She paused in her examination, listening. Hear what? The water. The pattern. She exchanged a look with her partner, the kind of look that medical professionals learn to make when they're thinking concussion, when they're thinking observation, when they're thinking, this one's going to need a psych consult. There's a lot of water damage in these old places, she said carefully. Leaky pipes, failed seals. Could be coming from anywhere. Could be. That word carried more weight than she knew. They drove me out of the complex. As we passed through the gates, I looked back at the cooling towers, at the auxiliary building where the reservoir entrance stood hidden behind its welded door, at the whole vast expanse of the Blackwell facility. The morning sun caught the metal surfaces, made them gleam almost new, almost alive. And underneath that gleam, underneath the optimistic paint job of dawn, I could see the rust. Not just the surface oxidation, but the deep corrosion, the kind that worked from the inside out, that turned structure into suggestion, that made solid things hollow while leaving their shapes intact. The EMT was explaining something about the hospital, about x-rays and observation protocols, but I wasn't listening. I was watching the complex recede, and I was noticing something that made my chest tighten with an anxiety I couldn't quite name. There were no demolition markers, no equipment staged for the teardown I'd seen on the permits, no sign that anyone planned to return to this place at all. I pulled out my phone. They'd given it back after checking that I could provide emergency contacts, and tried to find those permits again, the demolition schedule I'd used to justify my intrusion. The browser loaded slowly, searching for the county website, for the archived documents, for any proof that what I remembered was real. The page didn't exist. Not anymore. Maybe it never had. At the hospital, they x-rayed my knee. Mild sprain, no permanent damage. They checked me for concussion. Negative. They asked if I wanted to speak with someone about the trauma of being trapped overnight in an abandoned building. I declined. What would I tell them? That I'd watched ghost workers counting their eternal shift? That the air had risen and fallen with purpose and intent? That somewhere deep in that complex, in that intermediate level that shouldn't exist between one darkness and another, there was still a catwalk running in a circle, and on that catwalk there was still the impression of where I'd sat, and in that impression there was still the question of what would have happened if the air had decided differently, if the counting had included me, if the pattern had made room for one more worker who couldn't remember how to stop. They released me that afternoon with crutches and painkillers and the phone number for a counseling service. I thanked them. I promised to follow up with my regular doctor. I signed all the forms that confirmed I'd been treated, that I'd been found, that I'd survived. But as I waited for my ride outside the emergency room, watching the afternoon traffic flow past on streets that suddenly seemed too bright, too loud, too insistently real. I found myself counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. Pause. 1, 2, 3, 4. My breathing, my heartbeat, the rhythm of my thoughts arranging themselves in sequences of 4, organizing themselves around a pattern I couldn't break and didn't fully remember learning. The counting had gotten out, or I'd brought it with me. Or, and this was the thought that made my skin prickle cold despite the warm September air, maybe I'd never left at all. Maybe I was still down there on that catwalk, my mind already worn into grooves by repetition and darkness, already joining the phantom maintenance crew in their eternal shift. Maybe what I thought was rescue was just another layer of the pattern, another sequence in the counting, another drop of water falling into the dark. Drip, 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 drip. I closed my eyes and tried to break the rhythm, tried to think in 3s or 5s or anything that wasn't the 4-beat pattern of the counting room. But the pattern held. It had gravity. And somewhere in the abandoned spaces between what I remembered and what actually happened, between the rescue I experienced and the rescue that occurred, I could feel that gravity pulling. Not pulling me down. That would have been too simple. Pulling me back. Because the complex wasn't scheduled for demolition. The permits didn't exist. And if no one was planning to return, if no one was monitoring or maintaining or remembering that place, then who would notice if one of the workers didn't leave? Who would mark the absence? Who would count? My ride arrived. I got in. We drove away from the hospital, toward my apartment, toward my ordinary life with its bills and responsibilities and routines that had nothing to do with rust, or darkness, or counting. But as we passed the state forest land that bordered the Blackwell complex, I looked out the window and saw the cooling towers rising above the tree line. They looked closer than they should have, more present, as if they'd moved while I wasn't watching, as if they were keeping pace with the car, matching speed, maintaining distance, and underneath the sound of traffic and radio and my driver's cheerful small talk about the weather, I heard it. Drip, 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 drip. The counting hadn't stopped. It never stopped. It was just waiting for the next shift to begin, for the next worker to find the gap in the fence, to feel that gravity pulling them down, to join the pattern that had worn itself so deep into those spaces that it existed independently of the physical structure that had once contained it. I touched my knee where it had hit the platform, where something warm and soft had been waiting to catch me, where the rust had felt almost welcoming, almost gentle, like it had been expecting me all along. The scar wouldn't form for another week, but when it did, I would trace its outline and find a pattern there. 4 marks, 4 raised lines on the skin, permanent and precise, like a brand, like a signature, like a receipt for a shift that hadn't ended, a contract I didn't remember signing, written in rust and counted in drops of water that fell forever in the dark. Story 4. The stairs to the 3rd floor exhaled heat like a living thing's breath. Thick, wet, deliberate. My glasses fogged the moment I reached the landing, and I had to pause, wiping the lenses with the hem of my shirt while sweat gathered at my temples. The duplex stood on Garland Street, flanked by gutted shells and overgrown lots. But this one had intact windows. That alone made it an anomaly in this part of Detroit. The city had logged it as abandoned for 18 months, but the tip I'd received suggested otherwise. Someone was using it. For what, nobody wanted to guess. I worked for the county assessor's office, documenting properties in transition. It was tedious work mostly, photographing empty rooms, noting structural damage, checking for squatters or copper thieves. But every few weeks, I'd stumble onto something that made the job worthwhile. A room full of stolen goods, a makeshift meth lab, once even a greenhouse operation sophisticated enough to have timers and UV lamps. That's what I expected here. The heat made sense for that. The intact windows made sense. Everything made sense until I actually stepped inside. The kitchen hit me first. Not visually, the light was dim, filtering through grime-coated windows. but physically, a wall of temperature that made my lungs work harder. An old Mr. Coffee sat on the counter, its orange light glowing, the glass carafe bone dry and faintly scorched at the bottom. The heating element must have been running for days. Beside it, the stove. All four burners turned to high, blue flames licking at nothing. The oven dial cranked to its maximum, 550 degrees, door closed. I could see the air shimmer above the range, but no plants, no hydroponic setup, no grow lights, no humidity trays, just heat, purposeful and maintained. The floorboards creaked as I moved through the space, my boots sticking slightly to linoleum that had buckled and warped. The cabinets hung open, empty except for a single coffee mug placed rim down on the middle shelf, as if drying. The refrigerator door stood ajar, interior dark and warm. Someone had unplugged it, but left the door open enough to prevent mildew. Thoughtful, deliberate, wrong. I documented it all with my camera, the flash creating stark shadows that seemed to linger too long after each shot. The living room was similarly barren, furniture pushed against the walls, center of the floor clear, not empty, cleared. The difference mattered. Dust had settled uniformly across every surface except for a narrow path worn into the hardwood, a circuit that ran from the kitchen doorway around the perimeter of the room and back again. Someone had been pacing, recently and repeatedly. The bedroom was on the third floor, up another narrow staircase that creaked with each step. The heat intensified as I climbed, and by the time I reached the top, my shirt clung to my back. The door stood open. Inside, the bed was made with military precision. The comforter pulled so tight I could have bounced a quarter off it. Hospital corners. Not a wrinkle, not a sag. The kind of perfection that required daily attention. On the nightstand, an ashtray, green glass, with a cigarette stub still balanced on its edge. I leaned closer. The ash was intact, a gray cylinder that hadn't been disturbed by movement or air current. When I held my hand above it, I felt warmth. Not just ambient heat, focused warmth, as if it had been extinguished minutes ago, not hours or days. The closet door was closed but not latched, hanging open a crack. Through the gap, I saw hangers, empty hangers, evenly spaced, all facing the same direction. I pulled the door wider. At the back of the closet, someone had written on the wall in pencil, "Temperature maintenance log, day 47. Below it, tally marks, hundreds of them, organized in groups of 5, then groups of 10, then breaking into chaotic scratches that covered 2 square feet of drywall. I photographed it, my hands unsteady. The fan caught my attention as I turned back to the bedroom, a small oscillating model, perched on a dresser, its head sweeping back and forth in mechanical rhythm. The cord trailed across the floor to an outlet. I knelt beside it, following the line with my eyes to where it disappeared behind the dresser. The breaker box was downstairs, and I knew for a fact the power company had disconnected this address 14 months ago. I'd checked the records before coming. Yet the fan turned, hummed, breathed artificial wind across my face as it rotated past. I pulled the dresser away from the wall. The outlet was there, the plug seated firmly. I traced the wire into the wall, then down. Somewhere in the cavity between studs it connected to... what? A generator would be loud, would smell like gasoline. Batteries would have died long ago. But the fan kept turning, its motor purring with the contentment of steady, reliable power. The words came out without thought, more exhale than speech. This whole place is a goddamn museum of chaos. The temperature dropped, not gradually, not the slow evening cool down of a house releasing its daytime heat. This was immediate and total, as if someone had opened an invisible door to winter. My breath misted. The sweat on my skin went cold. The fan's blade slowed, each rotation taking longer than the last, until it stopped entirely with a click that echoed wrong in the small space. Too loud, too final. Downstairs, something metal contracted with a sharp crack. The oven, I realized. Cooling too fast, the metal protesting the sudden temperature change. And then, the smell. Ozone, sharp and electric. The scent that follows lightning strikes or comes from old photocopiers running too long. It filled my sinuses, made my teeth ache. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat, could hear the tiny crackle of my hair moving against my collar as I turned my head. I left the room, walked down the stairs with measured steps, one hand on the railing, though I didn't trust it to hold my weight if I stumbled. The kitchen was dark now, the Mr. Coffee's light extinguished, the stove burners cold and black. I ran my hand over one. Room temperature. Not warm, not cooling, as if it had been off for hours. My camera bag slipped from my shoulder as I fumbled for my phone. The screen's glow felt obscene in the darkness, too bright, too modern. No signal, but that wasn't unusual in these old houses. Thick walls, metal lathe and plaster. I pulled a bottle of water from my bag. I always carried two, one for me and one to leave behind as a courtesy for any genuine squatters I might encounter. A small gesture, but it had kept confrontations peaceful more than once. I set it on the counter beside the sink, the plastic making a hollow sound against the tile. Then I walked out, my footsteps loud on the stairs, the front door's hinges shrieking as I pulled it open. Outside, the September afternoon was mild and bright. Normal. The kind of day that made you forget places like this existed. I didn't look back. Not while walking to my car, not while pulling away from the curb. The duplex stood there in my rearview mirror, windows catching the sun, looking like any other house on a street full of houses waiting to die. My supervisor called it a probable setup for a squatter with a generator, told me to log it and move on. I did. Entered the address, noted the active heat sources and makeshift power, recommended a follow-up inspection in 30 days. Then I moved to the next property, and the one after that, filling my days with the ordinary decay of a city that had learned to make peace with its own abandonment. But 3 days later, my route took me past Garland Street. I had no reason to stop. The duplex wasn't on my schedule, and I had 6 properties to document before sunset. Yet when I reached the intersection, my foot found the brake. The house stood there, same as before, except the third-floor window was open. Not broken, not hanging loose. Open, the frame pushed up, the curtain pulled outside and hanging down the exterior wall, held in place by a safety pin. The pin was silver, the kind you'd use for baby clothes or to temporarily fix a hem. I'd seen it before, on the table in the living room, next to a spool of black thread and a pair of scissors that looked like they'd been used to cut hair. Someone had taken that pin, climbed out the window or reached through it, and secured the curtain to the siding. Why? To air out the room? But the heat was gone. The house looked cold now, somehow, despite the sunshine. The windows seemed darker, as if the glass had thickened. A figure moved past the third-floor window. Just a shadow, really, a shift in the dimness behind the glass. There and gone. I told myself it was the curtain, moved by wind funneling through the open window. But the curtain hung straight down, pinned and motionless. I drove away. Didn't log it. Didn't mention it to anyone. That night I dreamed of the house. In the dream, I was standing in the bedroom again, and someone was making the bed while I watched. I couldn't see them clearly. They moved in the peripheral darkness, hands smoothing the comforter, tucking the corners. The fan was running again, and with each pass of its breeze, the temperature in the room changed. Hot, then cold, then hot again. The cigarette in the ashtray was burning, a thin line of smoke rising straight up, defying the wind from the fan. The figure making the bed turned to me and said something, but no sound came out. Their mouth moved, forming words I should have been able to understand, but silence filled the space where speech should have been. I woke up sweating, my bedroom ceiling fan casting shadows that looked wrong until I blinked them back into ordinary shapes. The next week, a water main broke on Garland Street. The city sent a crew to shut off service to the affected homes, and they reported that the duplex's meter was running. Slowly, barely registering, but running, as if someone inside was using just enough water to keep the pipes from freezing. In September, I went back, told myself it was for work, for due diligence, for the sake of thoroughness. The front door was locked this time, deadbolt engaged from the inside. I called out, identifying myself, explaining that I was with the assessor's office and needed to verify occupancy. No response. I circled the building, looking for other entrances, finding none. The basement windows were sealed with concrete block. The back door had been removed entirely, the frame boarded over from inside with fresh lumber, the nail heads bright and unrusted. The third-floor window was still open. The curtain still hung outside, still pinned, as I stood there looking up. The water bottle I'd left caught my eye through the kitchen window. It sat exactly where I'd placed it, but the water level was lower, not empty, maybe 2/3 full, as if someone had been taking small sips, rationing it, making it last, or as if it had been evaporating, in a cold house, with no sun reaching that counter. I left, added a note to the file. Possible occupant, unable to make contact, recommend social services follow-up. Then I closed the case and moved on to other streets, other houses, other mysteries that didn't cling to my thoughts like cobwebs. But sometimes, late at night when I'm trying to sleep, I think about that house, about the heat that shouldn't have existed and the cold that came too fast, about the fan that ran without power and the cigarette that stayed warm, about the water level dropping in a sealed bottle and the curtain pinned outside a window on the third floor. I think about the circuit worn into the living room floor, and I imagine someone walking it endlessly, pacing the same path hour after hour, day after day, maintaining something. Temperature, sanity, the boundary between presence and absence. And I wonder if a house can learn to breathe, if it can consume electricity and heat and time, if it can remember the shape of the person who lived in it, and hollow out a space for them to continue existing. What happens when you acknowledge it? When you name what it is, even mockingly, even without understanding? I called it a museum, a place where things are preserved, kept exactly as they were, maintained against the natural decay of time. And maybe that's what I created with those words, or maybe that's what it already was, and I just finally saw it for what it was. The house is still there. The city's demolition list is long, and Garland Street is low priority. Sometimes I drive past it, late at night when I can't sleep, when my own home feels too empty and too full at the same time. The third-floor window is always open now. The curtain has faded in the weather, but the safety pin still holds. And sometimes, not every time, but sometimes, there's a light moving behind the windows. Not electric light. Too orange for that. The warm, flickering glow of an oven running at maximum heat, or a coffee pot that's been burning dry for so long the glass has started to melt. I never stop, never park, never get close enough to be sure of what I'm seeing, because I understand now what I didn't understand then. The house wasn't empty. It was never empty. Someone lived there. Someone lives there still, and they live there the only way they know how, maintaining the temperature, walking the same path, keeping the cigarette warm in its ashtray, making the bed each morning with the precision of ritual. Someone lives with the house. The house lives with them, and I'm terrified of what might happen if I ever go back and find out which one is the ghost. Story 5. The fog came in thick that afternoon, the kind that turns the Maine coast into something prehistoric. It rolled off the Atlantic in gray waves, swallowing the rocks below and climbing toward the cliff top where the Ashford mansion had stood empty for 17 years. My colleague insisted we had maybe an hour of decent light left for photographs, but I could already feel the moisture settling into my jacket, cold and invasive. We'd driven 4 hours for this. Urban exploration wasn't really my thing. I was there for the architectural documentation, the clean lines and measured angles that would look good in my portfolio. But Desmond had been talking about the Ashford place for months, ever since he'd found the listing buried in some obscure forum about abandoned New England estates. The house had a reputation, he said, though he'd been frustratingly vague about what kind. The Victorian mansion loomed against the darkening sky, all steep gables and widow's walks, paint peeling in long strips like shed skin. The wrought iron fence around the property had collapsed in sections, and we stepped through easily, our boots crunching on gravel overgrown with dead grass. Up close, I could see how the salt air had eaten at everything. The decorative trim above the windows had gone soft and gray, and rust bled down from every metal fixture in long orange tears. Desmond was already at the front door, testing the handle. Locked, but one of the ground floor windows had been broken out, probably by kids or previous trespassers. He gave me a look that was half excitement, half challenge, and squeezed through. After a moment's hesitation, I followed. The interior smelled of mildew and something else, something almost sweet underneath the decay, like old perfume. We stood in what had been a grand entrance hall, with a curved staircase rising into shadows and doorways branching off in 3 directions. Wallpaper hung in strips, revealing multiple layers beneath, floral patterns over geometric designs over what might have been the original plaster. Our footsteps echoed too loudly. That's when I heard it. A steady mechanical clicking from somewhere deeper in the house. Tick-tock, tick-tock, precise and unchanging. Desmond heard it too. He grinned at me, that look he got when he thought he'd found something interesting, and moved toward the sound. I followed him through an archway into what must have been the main parlor. The ceiling was high here, elaborate molding still visible despite the water damage. Furniture shapes hulked under dust-covered sheets, and in the fading light through the tall windows, everything seemed to shift slightly, as if breathing. On a mahogany buffet against the far wall, a metronome ticked away. Not an expensive one, just a plastic pyramid, the kind music students use, wound tight and keeping perfect time. Desmond reached for it, but I caught his arm. Something about it felt wrong. The dust on the buffet was thick everywhere except around the metronome's base, where it sat in a perfect clean circle. We stood there for a while, watching the pendulum swing. Desmond suggested someone must have wound it recently, squatters or other explorers, but the house felt genuinely empty. There were no sleeping bags, no evidence of campfires or makeshift living spaces, none of the usual signs of human occupation I'd seen in other abandoned buildings. I pulled my attention away from the metronome and looked at the floor. That's when I noticed the marks. The wooden floorboards were scratched in a wide circular pattern, centered roughly in the middle of the room. Deep gouges in the wood, as if heavy furniture had been dragged around and around the same path, over and over, until the motion had carved itself into the very structure of the house. But the furniture that sat there now, the sheet-covered shapes I'd noticed when we entered, were positioned normally, against the walls, nowhere near the circle. Desmond was already moving again, heading toward a doorway that led deeper into the house. I wanted to tell him about the marks, about how they suggested something more than abandonment, but he was already gone, his footsteps receding down what sounded like stairs. I followed because the alternative was staying alone in that room with the metronome. The basement stairs were narrow and steep, the kind that had probably been used by servants when this place was functioning. My hand on the railing came away dusty, but I could feel the smooth spots beneath, places where generations of hands had gripped. The air grew colder as we descended, and damper, with that particular underground smell of earth and stone. At the bottom, Desmond had stopped. He was staring at something on the floor, and when I came up beside him, I saw it too. A torch, one of those LED camping torches, lying on the concrete floor. It was on, casting a cold blue-white light across the basement's vaulted ceiling. The light was steady and bright, no dimming that would suggest a dying battery. My throat felt tight. I told Desmond we should leave, that someone must be here, but he was already picking up the torch, examining it. He argued that it could have been left behind, that LED batteries lasted a long time, but the concrete floor around the torch was disturbed, as if someone had knelt there recently, and when I looked closer, I could see the faint condensation of breath still evaporating from the metal casing. The basement was mostly empty, just stone walls and old shelving units that sagged under nothing. But there were marks here too. Not circular this time, but straight lines scored into the concrete, leading from the stairs to the far wall and back again, over and over. like someone had paced the same path for so long that their footsteps had worn grooves into the floor. Desmond suggested we stage a photograph down here, something atmospheric with the torch and the shadows. The idea made my skin crawl. I refused, more sharply than I'd intended, and in the silence that followed my voice, I heard the metronome upstairs change its rhythm. The tempo increased, ticking faster, the sound carrying down through the floorboards with crystalline clarity. We looked at each other. Neither of us had touched it. Neither of us had even been near it for several minutes. I climbed the stairs fast, Desmond behind me, both of us trying to be quiet and failing. When we reached the parlor, the metronome was ticking at what must have been nearly double its original speed, the pendulum a blur. I reached out to stop it, to wind it down or just knock it over, but Desmond grabbed my wrist. He was looking at something else, his face pale even in the dim light. The sheet-covered furniture had moved. Not far, not dramatically, but enough to be undeniable. They were positioned now at the edges of the circular marks on the floor, as if they'd been part of whatever ritual or routine had carved those grooves. We'd been gone perhaps 5 minutes. I didn't wait to see what else might change. I headed for the entrance hall, for the broken window we'd climbed through. But Desmond wanted to go upstairs first, to check the view from the widow's walk he'd seen in old photographs of the house. He was already climbing, telling me it would only take a minute, that we'd driven all this way. His voice had a strange quality, almost dreamy, as if he were speaking from very far away. Against every instinct, I followed him up. The stairs creaked under our weight, and I noticed more of those smooth spots on the banister, worn places that suggested specific hand grips, repeated endlessly. The second floor was a maze of bedrooms, all with their doors open, all empty except for the occasional piece of furniture too large or too damaged to have been worth removing. In several rooms, I saw more of those marks. Circular patterns, straight lines, evidence of motion repeated until it became permanent. The ladder to the widow's walk was in the last bedroom, a narrow space that must have been servants' quarters. The ladder was old wood but solid, and when we climbed up and pushed open the trapdoor, we emerged into the fog. The widow's walk was a narrow platform with a wrought iron railing, meant for watching the sea for returning ships. The fog was so thick now that I could barely see the ocean, just hear it crashing against the rocks below. The cold was immediate and penetrating, and I was about to tell Desmond we needed to leave when he grabbed my arm, pointing. At the far end of the platform, facing the ocean, stood a figure. It was wearing a dark robe or dressing gown, the fabric moving slightly in the wind. The figure was completely still, hands at its sides, posture rigid as it stared out at the invisible Atlantic. My heart lurched. We weren't alone. Someone else was here, had been here all along. I called out, my voice too loud and too nervous, asking if they were all right, if they needed help. The figure didn't move, didn't turn around, just stood there facing the water, sing. Desmond started moving toward it, and I hissed at him to stop, to leave it alone. But he kept going, reaching out as if to tap the figure's shoulder. His hand passed through air. The robe swung slightly on its hook, an iron hook driven into the railing, the kind meant for securing signal flags or lanterns. The robe was empty. Had always been empty. What we'd seen as a figure was just fabric and shadow and our own expectations. But I'd seen it standing. I'd seen the posture, the rigid stillness that suggested consciousness, attention. The robe couldn't have been standing unsupported. The physics didn't work. Yet there it was, hanging limply now, moving in the wind like any piece of abandoned clothing would. Desmond laughed, nervous and relieved, saying something about tricks of the light, about how creepy old places played with your perception. But I was backing toward the trapdoor because I'd noticed something else. The wooden planks of the widow's walk were worn smooth in a specific spot, right where the robe hung, worn smooth in the shape of feet. Standing feet, positioned exactly as they would be if someone spent hours up here, night after night, staring at the ocean. The wood was worn down by perhaps a 1/4 inch, the depression unmistakable. We climbed down. We went back through the house, past the parlor where the metronome had stopped entirely now, past the circular marks and the repositioned furniture, out through the broken window. The fog had grown even thicker, and we had to feel our way along the fence line to find where we'd parked the car. In the car, with the doors locked and the engine running, Desmond was already talking about coming back, about how we'd barely documented anything, about all the rooms we'd missed. He was excited, energized even, making plans. But I was thinking about those marks, about the metronome that wound itself and changed its tempo, about furniture that moved when no one was watching, about a robe that hung where something had stood for so long that it had worn grooves into solid wood. The house wasn't haunted, not in the traditional sense. There were no ghosts, no conscious presences we'd encountered. What remained in the Ashford mansion was something else. It was the residue of routine, the physical imprint of actions repeated so many times that they'd transcended the people who performed them. The house remembered. Not memories in any way we'd understand, but patterns, habits that had been carved into its structure through sheer repetition. Wind the metronome, move the furniture, pace the basement, stand on the widow's walk and watch the sea. The house didn't care who wound the metronome or why. It just remembered that the metronome was wound, and so it was. Someone had paced that basement. Someone had arranged and rearranged that furniture. Someone had stood on that widow's walk so many times that the actions themselves had become encoded in the space. And now the space performed them, over and over, with or without people to witness. What terrified me, what made my hands shake on the steering wheel as I pulled away from that place, was a simpler realization. We'd been in that house for perhaps an hour. We'd walked specific paths, touched specific objects, stood in specific places, and we'd done so following the subtle cues the house itself provided. The sound of the metronome drawing us in, the torch leading us to the basement, the robe directing our attention upward. The house had been showing us where to go, teaching us its patterns. And if we'd stayed longer, if Desmond had gotten his way and we'd spent the night documenting room after room, would we have found ourselves walking those same circles on the parlor floor, pacing those same lines in the basement, standing on the widow's walk until our feet wore their own depressions into the wood? I drive past that exit sometimes when I'm heading up the coast. There's no sign for the Ashford mansion, no historical marker or tourist trap. Just a turnoff onto a smaller road that leads to the cliff. I never take it. But sometimes, when the fog is rolling in thick off the Atlantic, I think about that house, about what it's doing right now, in its emptiness. The metronome is ticking. The furniture is moving. Something is standing on the widow's walk, watching the ocean, not someone. Just the memory of standing, so strong and so repeated that it doesn't need a person anymore. The habit itself has become enough. And I wonder sometimes if the house remembers us now too. If somewhere in its collection of patterns and routines, there's now a memory of two people climbing through a broken window, walking to the parlor, descending to the basement. I wonder if it's waiting for us to come back and complete the pattern, to teach it what comes next. Desmond still wants to return. He calls every few months, suggesting we give it another try, that we should properly document the place. He says it different each time, but the underlying message is always the same. We should go back. We should finish what we started. And here's what keeps me awake some nights. I can't quite remember whose idea it was to visit the house in the first place. Desmond says he found it online, in some forum, but I have a vague memory of seeing a photograph of the mansion somewhere else first, of being drawn to it, of needing to see it in person. Maybe we didn't choose the Ashford house at all. Maybe it chose us. Maybe we're already part of its collection, our visit already carved into its pattern. And maybe that's why I think about it so often, why my hands sometimes move as if winding an invisible metronome, why I catch myself standing at windows and staring out at nothing, standing so still that I could be mistaken for an empty robe hanging on a hook. The house teaches you its habits, and habits once learned are so very hard to break. Story 6. The detour seemed reasonable at first. Highway 108 had been closed for what the ranger called unscheduled maintenance, and my Aunt Diane knew these mountains well enough to suggest the old timber route. Her friend, a wiry man named Lowell, who'd worked forestry in the 70s, nodded along as she traced the deviation on her tattered map. We'd cut maybe 2 hours off our drive to Yosemite, he assured me, following what used to be a company road before the mills shuttered and the trees reclaimed their territory. The pavement surrendered to gravel within the first mile, then to something resembling a path only by virtue of parallel ruts worn into red earth. Afternoon sun slanted through the canopy, painting the windshield in shifting patterns of light and shadow. Diane hummed something tuneless beside me, while Lowell sprawled across the back seat, his hiking boots leaving dusty prints on the upholstery I'd stopped caring about hours ago. The GPS maintained its blue line with artificial confidence, a thread of certainty through increasingly uncertain terrain. Pine needles carpeted everything, muffling our tires until the Subaru seemed to glide rather than roll. We descended into what Lowell called a shadow valley, where the trees grew so dense and tall that dusk arrived 3 hours early, and the temperature dropped enough that I could see my breath when I exhaled against the window. That's when the road simply ended. Not gradually, not with warning signs or barriers, but with the absolute finality of a sentence cut mid-word. The ruts disappeared into a mat of rust-colored needles, and ahead stretched only the monotonous repetition of trunks and shadow. I stopped the car and let the engine idle, its mechanical rhythm suddenly too loud in the suffocating silence of ancient forest. Lowell leaned forward between the front seats, his flannel shirt smelling of wood smoke and something medicinal. He squinted at the GPS, then at the windshield, then back at the screen with the particular frustration of someone watching technology betray basic logic. The blue line continued straight ahead through what appeared to be virgin woodland, as if the satellite couldn't comprehend that roads must exist to be traveled. We sat there for what felt like an unreasonable amount of time, the three of us staring at the impossible continuation of a route that no longer existed. The forest pressed in on all sides, patient and ancient, and I became aware of how thoroughly alone we were. No cell signal, no sounds of distant traffic, no contrails scoring the thin strip of darkening sky visible through the canopy. Just us, the idling engine, and the pines. Diane suggested we scout ahead on foot, maybe 50 yards, just to see if the trail resumed beyond some fallen timber or washout. It seemed reasonable. It seemed like something people who weren't foolish would do. Lowell grabbed a flashlight from his pack, even though we had perhaps an hour of usable daylight remaining, and I pocketed my phone despite its uselessness, clinging to the ritual of preparation even when the tools had failed. The forest floor gave softly beneath our boots, decades of needles creating a cushion that swallowed sound. We walked single file, Diane leading with the confidence of someone who'd spent her 20s working fire lookouts in these mountains, Lowell behind her, me bringing up the rear. The GPS insisted we were on course. The reality disagreed. We found the warehouse after 20 minutes of walking, though found suggests we were looking for it, and warehouse implies something more substantial than what actually stood in that clearing. It was a gable-roofed structure, perhaps 30 feet long, its siding weathered to the color of old bone. Industrial, brutally functional, the kind of building erected with the assumption of abandonment. Windows lined the walls at regular intervals, each one boarded from the inside with planks I could see through the gaps, their nail heads gleaming like small watching eyes. The door hung open. Just slightly, just enough to suggest invitation or warning, I couldn't determine which. A dried wreath of some kind hung from a nail above the frame, brown leaves and desiccated berries twisted into a circle that might have been decorative once. Now it looked like something that marked territory, a sign in a language we hadn't learned but could instinctively read. Diane approached first, her boots crunching on something that wasn't pine needles. The ground around the structure had been swept or worn clean, exposing hard-packed dirt the color of rust. And pressed into that dirt, clear as photographs, were footprints. Bare feet, adult-sized. Recent enough that the edges hadn't crumbled. Preserved in soil that morning dew had softened and afternoon sun had set like plaster, they circled the building in a pattern that suggested pacing or patrol, emerging from the tree line on one side and disappearing into it on the other. I counted 7 distinct sets before losing track of where one trail ended and another began. Nobody spoke. Speaking would have required acknowledging what we were seeing, making it real through the act of naming. Instead, Lowell swung his flashlight beam across the clearing, painting everything in stark white and shadow, and the light caught more prints leading away from the warehouse, away from us, deeper into the forest where the GPS insisted we needed to go. Diane suggested we head back to the car. Her voice came out thin, performatively casual, the way people sound when they're pretending not to be frightened. But Lowell had spotted something else, was already walking the perimeter with his light trained on the ground, and I found myself following because going back meant admitting we were lost, while going forward meant we were still exploring, still in control, still executing a plan rather than fleeing. The tracks led us northeast, or what I assumed was northeast, based on the sun's position when we'd entered the Shadow Valley. They wove between trees with deliberate purpose, never straying far from a line that, when I checked my phone's compass, aligned almost exactly with the GPS route. Someone had walked this path barefoot in the last day, maybe the last few hours, walking where we were meant to drive, following the same invisible thread of data that had brought us here. I should have insisted we turn back. I should have recognized the moment we crossed from ordinary bad luck into something that had been arranged, prepared, made ready for our arrival. But the human mind resists pattern recognition when the pattern is too terrible to accept. We convince ourselves that coincidence explains coordination, that chance accounts for design, that we're observers of random events rather than participants in someone else's plan. The tarp shelter appeared after another 15 minutes of walking. It was erected beside a creek I hadn't heard until we were nearly upon it, the water moving with a silence that seemed wrong for its speed and depth. The shelter itself was military grade, stretched tight over a frame of fresh-cut branches, the cuts still weeping sap. Beneath it, arranged with the precision of a surgical tray, sat cooking equipment. 3 pots graduated by size, a cast-iron skillet, utensils sorted by function, and laid parallel on a flat stone. Burlap sacks hung from the frame, tied with knots so complex they seemed less functional and more decorative, their purposes obscured by the deliberateness of their binding. No fire pit, no sleeping bag, no trash or food scraps or any of the casual disorder that accompanies human habitation. Just these objects, placed and waiting, as if the camp were a museum display of camping rather than an actual camp. I photographed it. The act felt necessary, a way of creating evidence, of making witness to something I already suspected no one would believe. The camera clicked, loud in the forest silence, and in the moment between the sound and the image appearing on my screen, I heard something else. A whistle, short, sharp, descending. Then again from a different direction, and again from somewhere behind us, back the way we'd come. Diane grabbed my arm. Her fingers dug in hard enough to bruise, and when I looked at her face, I saw something I'd never seen there before. Pure, animal fear. Lowell had frozen mid-step, his flashlight beam pointed at the ground, and I realized he'd turned it off, that we were standing in the gathering darkness without light because light would announce our position, would mark us as clearly as the bare footprints marked their makers. We ran. Not immediately, not with the panicked scramble of prey, but with the horrible forced calm of people who understand that running might trigger pursuit, who hope that walking quickly, purposefully, naturally, might let them pass unnoticed. We retraced our path, but the forest had changed in the failing light, trees multiplying, distances expanding, the warehouse appearing and disappearing between trunks, like something that existed only in peripheral vision. The whistles continued. They came from no fixed location, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes from what I would have sworn was directly overhead, except that made no sense. Nothing made sense. And I was beginning to doubt whether we'd ever really seen a warehouse or a camp or anything at all. Whether this was some shared delusion brought on by carbon monoxide from a leaking exhaust or spores from some hallucinogenic fungus, or simply the human mind's capacity for collaborative madness. We found the car. Thank God or chance or whatever navigation instinct we'd retained. We found the car sitting exactly where we'd left it. Engine cold, doors unlocked, interior smelling of stale coffee, and the vanilla air freshener dangling from the rearview mirror. I started it with shaking hands, reversed in a spray of pine needles, and drove back up the trail we'd descended, following our own tire tracks because the GPS had gone dark, its screen showing only a blue dot floating in undifferentiated gray, all maps dissolved, all routes erased. We didn't speak. Diane stared straight ahead, her hands folded in her lap with unnatural stillness. Lowell had wedged himself into the back seat's corner, his face turned toward the rear window, watching, always watching. The sound started about 20 minutes into our retreat. Rocks dislodging behind us, their clatter perfectly synced with our own engine noise, so that each pop and rumble of our passage was echoed, answered, mimicked. Footsteps keeping pace with tire rotations. I accelerated and the sounds accelerated. I slowed and they slowed. I stopped once, engine idling, and the sounds stopped too, but resumed the instant I pressed the accelerator, as if whatever followed us had perfect knowledge of our intentions, could read our movements before we made them. The Shadow Valley seemed longer on the return. The trees pressed closer. The road, such as it was, narrowed until branches scraped both sides of the Subaru, their fingernails on chalkboard screech setting my teeth on edge. Diane had begun crying silently, tears tracking down her face without expression, without sound, as if her body had decided on terror, independent of her conscious mind. We reached the paved road as full darkness fell. The transition was jarring, brutal, like surfacing from deep water. Suddenly there were lines painted on asphalt, reflectors catching our headlights, a speed limit sign announcing 45 mph, as if such specificity mattered, as if numbers and rules still applied. I turned onto the highway without stopping, without checking for traffic because stopping meant acknowledging what we'd left behind, and I wasn't ready for that acknowledgement. We drove for an hour before anyone spoke. When Diane finally broke the silence, her voice sounded wrong, too high, too young, the voice of someone much smaller trying to fill adult vocal cords. We shouldn't have gone there. Lowell said nothing. He was still watching the rear window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen him blink. We checked into a motel outside Sonora, an anonymous strip of rooms facing a parking lot where the lights buzzed and flickered with epileptic urgency. I carried our bags inside, took adjacent rooms, told Diane and Lowell I'd see them in the morning for breakfast. Normal words, normal actions. The performance of people who'd simply taken a wrong turn and lost an afternoon to bad directions. But I didn't sleep that night. I lay on sheets that smelled of industrial detergent and listened to the ice machine clunk and grind in its endless cycle. And through the thin walls I could hear Diane pacing, back and forth, her footsteps keeping rhythm with something I couldn't hear, some beat or signal that carried through the darkness from those mountains we'd fled. At 3 a.m. I checked my phone and found 17 photographs I didn't remember taking. The first showed the warehouse from our approach, its windows dark. The second showed it from closer, and in one of those windows, barely visible, a pale shape that might have been a face, or might have been a reflection of clouds. The third through 16th showed the same image, the perspective slowly shifting, the pale shape growing clearer, taking form, becoming something that wore human features the way a mask wears them, approximate but fundamentally wrong. The 17th photo showed the interior of my car, the back seat, taken from where I'd been sitting, angled toward the rear window. And in that window, barely illuminated by the dashboard lights, a hand pressed against the glass from outside. Not a human hand, or not entirely. The fingers were too long, the joints too many, the palm too broad. But it was making a gesture I recognized, a signal I'd seen before, the kind of wave you make when guiding someone backing up, when directing them along a path, when escorting them to where they need to go. I deleted the photos, all of them. Then I deleted them from the recently deleted folder. Then I factory reset my phone and told myself it was because of a software glitch, because the battery had been acting strange, because these things happen with technology. But I still have the feeling, 3 months later, I still have the feeling that we were guided into that valley, shown things we needed to see, then guided out again when the lesson was complete. That the whistles weren't warnings but signals, communication between elements of something larger, coordinating our passage through territory that permitted our presence only temporarily, only conditionally, only because something decided we should survive to carry this story forward. Diane won't discuss that day. When I tried calling her last week, She hung up the moment I mentioned the detour. Lowell's number is disconnected, his social media deleted, and the Forestry Service has no record of anyone by that name working fire watch in the 70s. Though I know he did. I remember her introducing him. I remember his stories. Sometimes late at night when sleep won't come and the darkness presses close, I pull up the map on my phone. I zoom in on that section of Highway 108, looking for the logging road we turned down, but it's not there. There's no route marked, no dotted line indicating an unpaved path, nothing but solid green forest coverage between the highway and the nearest fire road 15 miles south. According to the satellite imagery, we drove through terrain that never had roads, never had timber operations, never had any reason for human presence at all. According to the data, we couldn't have gone where we went. But the bruises on Diane's arm, where she grabbed me when the whistle started, those took 2 weeks to fade. And sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night, I glance in the rearview mirror and see my own face looking back. And for just a moment, I'm not certain it's my reflection. For just a moment, I wonder if the thing that guided us out of those mountains decided to follow, to keep watch, to make sure we understand that being escorted doesn't mean being freed. It just means someone knows exactly where you are. Story 7. The highway through New Mexico doesn't forgive distraction. 3 hours of asphalt stretched behind us like a black ribbon through the desert, and my partner sat curled against the passenger window, breathing shallow in the kind of sleep that comes from road fatigue. I'd promised we'd stop at the next rest area, though neither of us had seen one in over an hour. When the brown sign finally materialized from the darkness, rest area 2 miles, I felt relief wash through my shoulders, followed immediately by something else, something I couldn't name. The turnoff appeared suddenly, a narrow exit that peeled away from the highway at an awkward angle. No streetlights marked the approach. No welcoming glow promised facilities ahead. Just a black tongue of pavement disappearing into deeper black. I took the exit anyway, because my bladder insisted and because we'd already committed to the turn. The car's headlights carved a weak tunnel through the night, catching the edges of scrub brush and revealing nothing of what lay beyond the next 20 feet. The rest stop emerged from the darkness like a set piece wheeled onto a stage. A small parking lot, maybe a dozen spaces, all empty. Beyond that, the vague shapes of a covered pavilion and restroom building, their angles wrong somehow, as if designed by someone who'd only heard buildings described secondhand. My partner stirred when I killed the engine, her eyes opening to narrow slits. "Where are we?" Her voice carried the thickness of interrupted dreams. "Rest stop. I'll just be a minute." I stepped out into air that felt too still. Desert nights are supposed to be alive with sound. Insects, distant coyotes, the whisper of wind through ancient rock. This place held its breath. The temperature hung in that uncomfortable zone between warm and cool, making my skin prickle with uncertainty about whether to shiver or sweat. The car door closing behind me sounded like a gunshot in the silence, and I caught myself looking around, suddenly aware of how exposed we were, how alone. The restroom building squatted in the darkness ahead, a rectangular shadow slightly darker than the surrounding night. I started toward it, fumbling for my phone to use as a flashlight, when movement caught my peripheral vision. 2 figures stood near the exit ramp, the narrow throat where the access road rejoined the highway. They hadn't been there when we'd pulled in. I was certain of that. They wore athletic gear, the kind of moisture-wicking fabrics that practically glowed in even minimal light. In this darkness, they should have been invisible, but instead they stood out like highlighter marks on black paper. Too clean, too new. The fabric looked fresh from a store display, without the road dust that coated everything else in this part of the state. One of them raised something to chest height, something small and rectangular that caught what little ambient light existed and reflected it back in a dull gleam. An action camera, the kind used for extreme sports, for documenting moments worth remembering. They made no sound, didn't call out a greeting or warning, simply stood there in the narrow exit, positioned to make anyone leaving have to slow down, to navigate carefully around them. The one with the camera adjusted its angle slightly, and even from 30 feet away, I felt the weight of its lens swinging toward me. Something in my gut twisted. The instinct that lives deeper than thought, older than language, whispered a single word: leave. I turned back toward the car without visiting the restroom, my bladder suddenly a secondary concern. My partner was sitting up now, fully awake, her face pressed close to the window glass. She'd seen them too. Her hand was already on the door handle, not to get out, but as if ready to ensure it was locked. When I slid back into the driver's seat, she turned to me with eyes that reflected more than just the dashboard lights. "Don't stop," she said. It wasn't a request. I started the engine, and the two figures shifted their attention fully toward us. The motion was synchronized, mechanical, as if choreographed. Neither one made an aggressive move. No steps toward us, no threatening gestures. But the stillness of their observation carried more menace than any advance. The one without the camera raised his hand, not waving, just holding his palm up flat, fingers spread. A signal, a mark. I couldn't shake the impression that he was measuring something about us, calculating dimensions I couldn't perceive. I pulled out slowly, headlights sweeping across the parking lot and catching the edges of the pavilion. That's when I noticed the maintenance building on the far side of the complex, set back from the main facilities. A single fluorescent light buzzed inside it, visible through a grimy window, casting that particular greenish-white glow that makes everything look diseased. The door bore a faded sign, "Out of service." But the light hummed on, steady and artificial in this lightless place. The car moved toward the exit, and we had no choice but to pass close to the two men. They didn't step aside. My foot hovered between gas and brake as I calculated the gap, the angle, how much room I'd need to navigate between their position and the concrete barrier marking the turn. The one with the camera shifted it slightly, angling the lens to track our movement. The red recording light blinked once, twice, steady as a heartbeat. Then he tapped the side of the camera with two fingers. Deliberate, intentional, like marking time, like noting a timestamp, like documenting the exact moment we passed through his frame. Our eyes met through the windshield, and his expression communicated nothing. No curiosity, no hostility, no recognition of our shared humanity. Just that flat, measuring stare, the look of someone categorizing data, filing information for later retrieval. We slipped past them with inches to spare. I accelerated up the entrance ramp, merging back onto the empty highway with enough speed that the tires squealed slightly. My partner kept her eyes locked on the side mirror, watching as the rest stop receded behind us. "They're still standing there," she said, "not moving, just watching us leave. Maybe they're just waiting for a ride." Even as I said it, the words felt hollow. People waiting for rides didn't stand in exit lanes, didn't hold action cameras like surveillance equipment, didn't wear pristine athletic gear to rest stops on deserted highways. She didn't respond, and her silence said everything about how convincing my explanation had been. The dashboard clock read 2:47 a.m. I focused on the white line streaming past, on putting distance between us and that place. The highway stretched empty in both directions, no other headlights visible in the darkness. We might have been the only car left in the world. That's when the dashboard went dark. Not the headlights. Those stayed on, still carving our path through the night. But every interior light, every digital display, the speedometer and fuel gauge and temperature reading, all of it simply ceased to exist. For one breathless second, the cabin became a cave of absolute darkness, the only illumination coming from the reflected headlight glow off the pavement ahead. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, waiting for the engine to die, for the power steering to lock, for whatever malfunction this represented to cascade into full failure. My partner drew a sharp breath beside me, and I could feel her fear as a physical presence in the confined space. Then, just as suddenly, everything flickered back to life. The displays re-illuminated, the numbers and warnings and indicators all resuming their patient vigil. The clock now read 2:48 a.m., having tracked time through the interruption as if nothing had happened, as if the darkness had been a shared hallucination. What the hell was that? My voice came out steadier than I felt. "I don't know." She kept staring at the dashboard, waiting for it to betray us again. Electrical fault? Maybe. But I'd been driving this car for 3 years without a single electrical issue. It had sailed through its last inspection with perfect marks. There was no maybe about it. No reasonable explanation for a momentary total failure followed by immediate recovery. We drove for another hour in tense silence, both of us hyper-aware of every small sound, every flicker of the dashboard lights, every shadow at the edge of the headlight beams. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see headlights closing in behind us, though I couldn't have explained what I feared they might belong to, or why I associated pursuit with those two men standing in their impossible cleanliness at an abandoned rest stop. By the time we reached the next town, a small highway cluster of gas stations and fast food restaurants, the sky had begun to lighten with pre-dawn gray. We pulled into a 24-hour convenience store parking lot, and I finally allowed myself to unclench. The fluorescent lights of civilization felt like a reprieve, even though they cast the same greenish pall as that light in the maintenance building. My partner went inside to use the bathroom while I stood beside the car, stretching road-cramped muscles. The air here smelled of gasoline and fryer grease. Normal things, human things. A state police cruiser sat at the far end of the parking lot, and on impulse I walked over to it. The trooper inside, a woman with gray threaded through her hair and the weathered look of someone who'd spent years on these roads, rolled down her window with mild curiosity. I must have looked rough enough to warrant attention, or maybe she just sensed something in my approach. "Everything all right, sir?" "Yeah, fine, We stopped at a rest area about an hour back. Mile marker 247. There were these two men there and..." I paused, suddenly aware of how paranoid I was about to sound. It felt wrong. The whole place felt wrong. There was a light on in a building marked out of service. Her expression shifted, not exactly concern, but a sharpening of attention. She reached for the radio on her dashboard, pressed a button, and spoke into it with the clipped efficiency of long practice. "Dispatch, this is Unit 34. Can you confirm status of rest stop at mile 247? The radio crackled with static before a voice responded. 247 is the old county line stop. Decommissioned last March. No power, no water. It's been fenced off for months pending demolition." The trooper's eyes found mine, and I watched her mental gears turning, trying to fit my report into the framework of what dispatch had just confirmed. "Fenced off?" I repeated. There wasn't any fence. The facilities were open. We drove right in. She studied me for a long moment, and I couldn't read what she found in my face. Concern? Confusion? The look of someone who'd stumbled into something they didn't understand. "The county cut power to that block in April," she said slowly. "Vandalism issues. They pulled the meters, disconnected everything. There's been no electricity out there for 6 months. The maintenance building light. That steady fluorescent hum. But I saw..." "What you saw, sir, was probably moonlight or maybe some kids with flashlights. That place attracts the occasional trespasser, but I can assure you there's no power running to any of those structures." She was being professional, diplomatic, offering me a rational explanation that should have provided comfort. But her eyes told a different story. There was something in them. Not disbelief exactly, but recognition. The look of someone who'd heard similar stories before, or who'd seen their own share of inexplicable things on these desert highways. My partner emerged from the convenience store, coffee in hand, and caught sight of me talking to the trooper. She approached slowly, reading the tension in my posture. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yeah." I stepped back from the patrol car. "Just checking something." The trooper nodded once, a gesture that felt less like agreement and more like dismissal. As I walked back to our car with my partner, I heard the cruiser's engine start. The trooper pulled out of the lot quickly, heading not toward the highway, but onto a smaller access road, the one that would take her in the direction we'd come from, heading perhaps toward mile marker 247. We got back on the road as full daylight broke across the desert, painting the landscape in shades of rust and gold. The terror of the night should have faded with the darkness, burned away by the sun's honest light. But it clung to me like a smell I couldn't wash off, a frequency I couldn't stop hearing. My partner dozed fitfully in the passenger seat, and I drove with my eyes darting constantly to the mirrors, to the dashboard, to the road ahead. Looking for what? I couldn't have said. Another rest stop. Another pair of two clean figures. Another moment when the world's electricity decided to take a breath and leave us suspended in darkness. 3 days later, back home and settled into the routine of ordinary life, I searched online for information about that rest stop. Satellite imagery showed the facility clearly. The parking lot, the pavilion, the restroom building. But the maintenance structure my headlights had illuminated wasn't visible in the overhead shots. The space where it should have been showed only empty ground, as if the building had never existed at all. I found one news article from the previous year, a brief local story about the county's decision to decommission the site. At the bottom, in the comments section abandoned to spam and conspiracy theorists, someone had posted, "My wife and I stopped there in August. 2 men were filming near the exit. We didn't stay. 2 weeks later, we got a traffic citation in the mail from a camera system that supposedly doesn't exist in that county. The timestamp on the photo matched exactly when we passed those men." I never responded to that comment, never reached out to corroborate our experiences. Because some part of me, the part that still felt those men's eyes tracking our movement, that still remembered the synchronized precision of their observation, understood that confirmation would be worse than uncertainty. That knowing would trap me in a truth I wasn't equipped to carry. The action camera, the tapped fingers marking time, the impossible light humming in an abandoned building. These elements circle in my mind like vultures, never settling, never offering the relief of explanation. Sometimes I wonder if we passed some kind of test that night. If our refusal to stop, our instinct to leave, marked us as unsuitable for whatever purpose those men served. I wonder what would have happened if we'd been more curious, more trusting, if we'd stepped out of the car and asked what they were doing, why they were filming, what they wanted. I wonder if they're still there, standing in that narrow exit with their pristine clothes and their recording devices, waiting for the next car to pull off the highway, waiting to measure, to document, to mark the moment someone drives into their frame. And I wonder, in the hollow hours before dawn, when sleep refuses to come, what exactly they were measuring us for, what in saying we failed to meet the criteria for. What would have happened if the dashboard had stayed dark just a few seconds longer, if we'd been forced to stop on that empty highway, blind and vulnerable in the desert night? The worst part isn't the questions. It's the certainty, bone deep and unshakable, that somewhere in a room I'll never see, on a hard drive I'll never access, there exists footage of our car navigating that narrow exit, that our faces are captured in crystalline digital clarity, tagged with a timestamp, filed under some designation I cannot fathom, that we are documented, cataloged, known to something that should not know us. The highway continues to cut through the desert, black asphalt under endless sky. Mile marker 247 sits somewhere along its length, marked now by chain link fence and warning signs, officially closed to the public. The county completed the demolition last month, or so the news reports claim. The facilities have been razed, the pavement torn up, the site returned to raw desert. But I see that fluorescent light in my dreams, green, white, and humming, impossibly alive in a dead building. I hear the tap of fingers against plastic, marking time, marking us, marking some moment of significance in a schema I was never meant to understand. And sometimes, on late-night drives when the road stretches empty ahead and my partner sleeps beside me, I catch myself checking the rearview mirror. Not for police, not for other cars, but for 2 figures in athletic gear, standing impossibly still in impossible places, holding cameras that record more than light and movement, recording something else, something that looks like us but isn't quite, that moves like us but registers differently on their sensors, recording the moment we became data in an archive we never consented to, subjects in an experiment we can't prove existed, actors in a production that never acknowledged its own reality. The rest stop is gone now. The county says so. The satellite images confirm it. But absence isn't the same as non-existence, and sometimes, often, I feel the weight of that camera's lens still tracking me across distance and time, waiting patiently for the moment when I forget to look over my shoulder, when I let my guard down, when I accept that what happened was just a trick of exhaustion and darkness, and an overactive imagination. That's the moment they're waiting for, I think. The moment I convince myself it wasn't real, because that's when I'll know, with terrible certainty, that it was. Story 8. We found the vineyard estate in late October, when the Sonoma Valley mornings carried that particular thickness, fog that clung to your lungs and made you aware of your own breathing. The property sat at the end of a gravel road that wound through abandoned rows of grapevines, their leaves rust-colored and brittle. Wisteria had consumed the south-facing wall of the main house, its gnarled vines thick as a man's thigh, purple blooms long since withered to brown paper husks that rattled in the wind. My partner had found the listing buried in an obscure rental forum. The price was absurdly low for the area, and the only stipulation was that tenants could occupy the top floor exclusively. The rest of the estate, the main floors, the cellars, the processing rooms, remained off limits, though the listing assured us we'd have full access to the grounds. We needed isolation for our writing project, a place where the world couldn't reach us. This seemed perfect. The realtor met us at the gate with keys and a manila folder of documents. He was a thin man who spoke in quick, clipped sentences and refused to step beyond the property's threshold. The vineyard's owner lived overseas, he explained, and preferred minimal contact. Month-to-month lease, utilities included, no questions asked. He pressed the keys into my palm with cold fingers and drove away before we'd even reached the front door. The house announced itself through smell first, that particular mustiness of spaces long sealed, mixed with something sweeter, more organic. Fermenting fruit, perhaps, though the pressing season had ended weeks ago. The entrance hall stretched before us, its hardwood floors dulled by decades of accumulated grime. A massive staircase curved upward to our right, its banister carved with grape clusters and vine leaves. Everything, the wallpaper, the furniture visible through doorways, the very air itself, felt trapped in 1940. We explored the ground floor despite the rental agreement. The kitchen held a cast iron stove and an icebox, its rubber seal cracked and peeling. The parlor's furniture sat arranged for a gathering that never came, dust sheets draped over chairs and sofas like shrouds. But it was the wine processing room that stopped us both. A row of 6 stone lagares dominated the space, each empty trough large enough to hold 3 men standing. They stretched toward the back wall, where a series of stone tunnels spiraled upward into darkness. The tunnels were narrow, claustrophobic, their purpose unclear. Perhaps they'd once been part of an elaborate cooling system, or routes for moving barrels between levels. Either way, they emanated a cold that had nothing to do with temperature, a coldness that felt aware. Wooden crates lined the walls, stacked floor to ceiling. Each held wine bottles with labels torn away, leaving only adhesive residue and fragments of text. My partner lifted one bottle, held it to the light. The glass was dark, the contents impossible to discern. We didn't open it. Something about those bottles, dozens upon dozens of them stripped of identity, felt deliberate, purposeful. The office sat adjacent to the processing room, connected by a narrow corridor. Unlike the other spaces, this room felt inhabited, despite the dust. Papers covered the desk in chaotic piles, their edges yellowed and curling. A ledger lay open, its columns filled with meticulous handwriting that became increasingly illegible toward the end, devolving into scratches and loops that might have been words, or might have been something else entirely. She sat in the corner, propped against a filing cabinet. The doll was adult-sized, nearly 4 feet tall, constructed from what looked like porcelain or very old plaster. Someone had stripped away her clothes, leaving her surface bare and gray with accumulated dust. Her eyes were painted on, 2 black dots that didn't quite align with where eyes should be. They seemed to track slightly left of center, as if perpetually looking at something just over your shoulder. In her lap, tangled in her rigid fingers, lay a rosary. The beads were dark wood, worn smooth by handling, and from the crucifix hung a small brass key. The key was old, ornate, meant for a lock that would require patience and precision to open. My partner suggested we take the key. We had no idea what it opened, but keys in abandoned places always seem to hold promise, or at least story potential. I reached for it, my fingers brushing the doll's hand. Her surface was cold, far colder than the room's ambient temperature, and textured in a way that made my skin crawl, not quite smooth, covered in microscopic cracks that caught at my fingertips. The rosary came free with minimal resistance, the key weighing almost nothing in my palm. We left the doll there and continued our exploration, though I could feel those misaligned eyes following us to the door. The top floor, our designated living space, was predictably more maintained than the rest of the house. Someone had made efforts here. The floors were cleaner, the walls had been repainted in the last decade, and the furniture, while sparse, was functional. A bed, a desk, 2 chairs, a small kitchenette with modern appliances that seemed obscene in this context. The windows looked out over the dead vineyard, row upon row of twisted vines disappearing into the valley's perpetual fog. But even here, wrongness seeped through. The walls were too thin, transmitting sounds from below with unnatural clarity. We heard nothing that first night, but I was aware of the potential for sound. The way you're aware of silence in a place that should be making noise. The house felt like it was holding its breath. We spent the evening unpacking and setting up our workspace. My partner arranged reference books on the desk while I tested the lamps, adjusted the bed, tried to make the space feel like ours. All the while, I kept returning to the key in my pocket, its metal warming against my thigh, wondering what it might unlock. At some point, my partner suggested we secure the doll. It seemed wrong, they said, to leave it exposed like that, vulnerable. I didn't ask vulnerable to what. We found a heavy wooden trunk in one of the hallway closets, its interior lined with cedar and smelling of old suits. Together, we carried the doll from the office, her weight unexpectedly substantial, her surface still that same disturbing cold. We placed her inside the trunk, folded her stiff limbs to fit, closed the lid, and pushed the trunk against the office wall. The rosary I kept, along with the key, tucking both into my jacket pocket. We locked the office door behind us, though the lock was old and probably useless, and returned to our floor feeling like we'd accomplished something important. That night, I dreamed of spiral tunnels and bottles without labels, of hands reaching up through stone troughs, fingers grasping at nothing. I woke repeatedly, convinced I'd heard footsteps on the stairs, but each time the house remained silent, wrapped in darkness so complete it felt solid. Morning brought no relief. If anything, the daylight only emphasized the estate's wrongness. The wisteria outside our window had somehow grown overnight, new vines creeping across the glass, blocking more of the already limited light. My partner mentioned it over coffee, their voice careful, measured, asking if I'd noticed. I had. We both agreed it was probably a trick of perspective, of morning shadows, of fatigue affecting our perception. We didn't discuss returning to the lower floors, but after breakfast, we found ourselves descending the stairs anyway. The house pulled at us, demanded exploration, insisted on being known. The office door stood open. We'd definitely locked it. And inside, the trunk remained against the wall, its lid closed. We'd planned to search for what the key might open, but curiosity drove us to check the trunk first. My partner lifted the lid while I stood back, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The trunk was empty. Not just empty of the doll, but empty in a way that suggested nothing had ever been inside it. No disturbance in the cedar lining, no scent of old dust, nothing. The doll sat on the tasting table in the adjacent processing room, positioned in the center with her legs dangling over the edge. The rosary was wound tight around her neck, not hanging loose as it had been, but wrapped multiple times like a collar, like a leash. The crucifix pressed against her throat. The key was gone. My partner's breath came fast and shallow beside me. Neither of us had moved the doll. Both of us knew we'd secured her in the trunk. Both of us understood, on some level we couldn't quite articulate, that the house was teaching us something about the rules here, about what was permitted and what was not. We should have left then, packed our things, driven back down that gravel road, disappeared into the valley's fog, and never looked back. Instead, we did what people always do in these situations. We rationalized. Maybe we'd been mistaken about the trunk. Maybe exhaustion had made us careless. Maybe one of us had moved the doll in a fugue state, sleepwalking, stress-induced confusion. Maybe. The days that followed blurred together, each one slightly more wrong than the last. The house's sounds grew more pronounced. Footsteps that could have been settling wood. Whispers that could have been wind through those spiral tunnels. A rhythmic tapping that could have been loose shutters. We worked on our project, filling pages with words that increasingly felt like they were being dictated rather than created. The prose took on a cadence we didn't recognize, describing places we'd never been, events we'd never witnessed. The attic. We'd seen the stairs leading up, narrow and steep, but the rental agreement had specified only the top floor. The attic was technically above our permitted space, existing in a gray area of the contract. On our fifth night, unable to ignore the pull any longer, we climbed those stairs. The room beyond should have been dark, dusty, filled with the detritus of decades. Instead, we found a space that belonged to a different timeline entirely. Someone had painted the walls recently, within the last few years, judging by the paint's condition. Posters covered one wall, bright and cheerful, depicting characters from children's media of the early 2000s. New curtain rods had been installed on the windows, though no curtains hung from them. The floor was clean, swept, maintained. A bed sat in the corner, its mattress bare but unstained. A toy box rested beside it, lid closed. Everything in this room spoke of preparation, of anticipation, of waiting for an occupant who never arrived, or perhaps arrived and left no trace of their presence. The contrast with the rest of the house was jarring, obscene even, as if someone had tried to drag this single room forward through time while leaving everything else behind. My partner found the photographs in the toy box. They were Polaroids, faded and water-damaged, showing the vineyard in various states. Some depicted the estate in what must have been the 1940s, the house pristine, workers visible in distant fields. Others showed progressive decay, the vines withering, the building's facade crumbling, the wisteria beginning its conquest. The final photograph showed the attic room itself, painted and prepared, with a figure standing in the center that my eyes refused to properly focus on. Not blurred, not obscured, but somehow resistant to perception, as if the camera had captured something that existed slightly outside of regular space. That figure wore rosary beads around its neck. We descended from the attic in silence, our footsteps loud on the wooden stairs, and returned to our floor. Neither of us slept that night. We lay in bed, listening to the house breathe around us, waiting for dawn, trying not to acknowledge the sounds coming from below. Rhythmic, purposeful, like something being dragged across stone. On the sixth morning, we encountered the neighbor. He'd appeared at the property's edge while we were attempting to take a walk through the dead vineyard, trying to convince ourselves that normalcy still existed somewhere beyond the estate's boundaries. He was old, his face weathered by decades of sun and wind, and he leaned on the fence post like he'd been waiting there for hours. He asked how we were finding the house, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. We told him it was fine, interesting, exactly what we needed. He nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the upper windows of the estate, and mentioned that in 40 years of living adjacent to the property, he'd never seen lights in those windows. Not once. Not even when the owner had supposedly made renovations. The house remained dark, he said. Always dark, even when people claimed to be living there. We insisted we'd seen lights. We'd turned on every lamp, used flashlights, worked by lamplight every evening. He just smiled, that sad knowing smile of someone who'd learned not to argue with other people's realities, and walked away. That night, I found the key. It was sitting on the desk in our workspace, positioned exactly in the center, placed with obvious intention. Neither of us had put it there. I'd kept it in my jacket pocket since taking it from the doll, and the jacket hung in the closet, the pocket empty. My partner swore they hadn't touched it, and I believed them, though I wasn't sure anymore if belief meant anything in this place. The key had to open something. That was its purpose, its entire reason for existence. We'd searched the obvious places, locked drawers, cabinet doors, the mysterious locked door in the hallway, but nothing fit. Now, standing in our workspace with that brass key-catching lamplight, I understood that we'd been looking in the wrong places. The key didn't open something in the house. It opened something in the house's understanding of us. My partner suggested we leave. Tomorrow, they said, first thing in the morning, we'd pack up and go. No explanation to the landlord, no discussion of lease terms, just departure. I agreed, felt relief at the decision, allowed myself to imagine being somewhere else. Somewhere where houses didn't hold their breath and dolls didn't migrate through locked spaces. But that night, I woke to find my partner standing at the window, staring out at the dark vineyard. Their posture was wrong, too stiff, too still, and when I called their name, they didn't respond. I got up, crossed the room, touched their shoulder. They turned, and in the moment before recognition flooded back into their eyes, I saw something else looking out at me through their face, something old and patient and hungry. Then they blinked, confused, asking why I'd woken them, saying they'd just been dreaming about tunnels and wine presses and a room that kept getting painted but never stayed clean. We went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about the attic, about that prepared room, about the photographs showing progressive decay, about the contract stipulating we could only occupy the top floor, about a neighbor who'd never seen lights, about a doll that moved through locked spaces and wore rosary beads like a collar. Morning arrived with the same thick fog, but something had changed. The wisteria had completely covered our windows, blocking out all natural light. When I tried to open the door to the hallway, it wouldn't budge. Not locked, just resistant, as if the house itself had decided we'd gone far enough, explored too much, learned things we weren't supposed to know. My partner is still sleeping, or something that looks like my partner is sleeping in the bed where my partner should be. I'm writing this by lamplight, knowing somehow that the lamp isn't really on, that the neighbor would look up at these windows and see only darkness. The key sits on the desk beside me, and I understand now what it unlocks. It unlocks the realization that we never left the processing room that first day, that we've been here, in these spiral stone tunnels, in these empty lageres, replaying the same moments of discovery over and over while something else lives our lives in the rooms above. The attic room was never prepared for a child. It was prepared for people like us, people who come seeking isolation and instead find incorporation, becoming part of the house's strange temporal loop, another layer of occupancy in a building that exists simultaneously in multiple decades. Or perhaps I've simply gone mad. Perhaps the isolation broke something in me, and these thoughts are just paranoia given form, delusion taking narrative shape. Perhaps my partner is exactly who they've always been, and the doll is just a doll, and houses don't breathe or think or trap people in their temporal wounds. But I can hear footsteps on the stairs now, ascending from below, that distinctive rhythm of something being dragged alongside them. And I know when I turn around, the doll will be sitting on our desk, rosary wound tight around her neck, those misaligned eyes looking just past me at something I can't see but can certainly feel. The house has been waiting, patient in its wrongness, letting us believe we had autonomy, that we were explorers rather than exhibits. And now, in this moment of understanding, I realize the most terrible thing. There is no difference between being haunted and being the haunt. The estate accepts temporary tenants, yes, but only in the top floor, only in the space between what was and what will be, existing nowhere and everywhere, perpetually arriving and never quite leaving. The fog outside hasn't lifted. I don't think it ever will. And somewhere in the valley, another couple is reading about an absurdly cheap rental in Sonoma, about a house covered in wisteria, about a strange stipulation that they'll interpret as quirky rather than warning. The key is warm in my hand now, warming to my touch as if recognizing its purpose has been fulfilled. And I'm beginning to suspect that what it unlocked was never a door or a drawer or a secret passage. It unlocked understanding. And understanding in this place might be the most dangerous thing of all. Story 9. The road to the retreat wound through red rock canyons like a scar, and I remember thinking how the shadows seemed to fall wrong. too sharp, too defined, as if someone had drawn them with a ruler. My college roommate sat beside me, drumming fingers against his thigh in that nervous way he had, while his girlfriend occupied the back seat, scrolling through her phone even though we'd lost signal 20 minutes ago. She kept scrolling anyway, thumb moving across a dark screen, and I wondered if she noticed. We'd heard about the Cedar Ridge spiritual retreat through the kind of stories that gain weight through repetition. Urban legend stuff. The friend of a friend who'd driven past and seen men standing perfectly still in the windows. The hitchhiker who'd been picked up nearby, speaking in tongues. The usual exaggerations that college kids trade like currency, each retelling adding another layer of fiction, but there was enough consistency in the details to make us curious, and curiosity is its own kind of hunger. The compound appeared suddenly around a blind curve, erupting from the landscape like a growth. A central courtyard ringed by low buildings, all painted that particular shade of white that suggests purity, but achieves only sterility. A tower rose from the center, maybe 40 feet high, topped with something that caught the late afternoon sun and threw it back in sharp fragments. For a moment, I thought the tower was made of mirrors. "There," my roommate said, pointing unnecessarily. I eased the car forward, tires crunching over gravel. The place felt abandoned at first glance. No movement, no sound except the wind that had suddenly picked up, carrying with it the smell of sage and something else, something chemical and sweet like printer toner. Then I noticed the vehicles, dozens of them, parked in perfect rows behind one of the buildings. White vans, all identical, their windows tinted so dark they looked painted. We completed the first curve of the central ring road, and that's when the bell started. Not a bell sound exactly, more like an alarm, but deeper, resonating in my chest cavity. A red light atop the tower began to pulse in steady rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. The silence that followed each pulse felt heavier than the sound itself, as if the world was holding its breath. The doors opened simultaneously. I counted 6, then 8, then lost count. Men emerged onto the verandas, all wearing identical gray coveralls, the kind mechanics wear but cleaner, pressed. They didn't run. Running would have been almost normal. Instead, they walked with the measured precision of pallbearers, forming 2 lines that converged on our vehicle from opposite directions. I felt my roommate's girlfriend lean forward between the seats. Her breath smelled like the mints she'd been eating since we left the highway, and I wondered absently if she'd eaten anything else all day. "This is weird," she said, voice thin. "This is really weird." But I was already smiling, already rolling down my window. Some part of my brain recognized this as theater, as performance meant to scare off the curious. I'd read about places like this, religious communities that valued privacy, that had learned to protect their isolation through calculated displays of strangeness. The best defense is to make people uncomfortable enough to leave on their own. I raised my hand in greeting, trying to project friendliness, trying to communicate that we meant no harm. The formation stopped 3 feet from the car. One of the men, older than the others with a face like weathered sandstone, stepped forward. He carried a short staff, darker wood than the landscape around us, carved with symbols I didn't recognize. He raised it and tapped the driver's side window. Not hard, just a tap, precise and deliberate, as if marking coordinates on a map. The sound echoed inside the car far longer than it should have. Behind him, another man had produced a notebook. Not a clipboard or tablet, but an actual spiral-bound notebook with a marbled cover, the kind I hadn't seen since elementary school. He was writing in it, pen moving with the careful slowness of someone transcribing something important. His eyes never left our license plate. The man with the staff pointed toward a sign I'd missed on our way in. Hand-painted letters, maybe 2 feet tall. Private property, turn back. Below it, smaller text I couldn't quite read from this distance. Something about visitors and documentation. "We should go," my roommate said. His voice had changed, taken on a hollow quality. "Yeah, we should definitely go." I put the car in reverse, moving slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. The formation of men didn't follow us. didn't even turn to watch. They stood frozen in their positions as we backed away, their faces blank as paper. Only the man with the notebook kept moving, hand still transcribing, filling page after page even though we were retreating. The red light atop the tower blinked 3 more times, then went dark. We completed our backward journey around the curve, and I saw what I'd missed before. 2 cameras on tripods positioned on either side of the entrance gate. Not modern security cameras. These were old, boxy things with actual film mechanisms visible through the casing. The kind you'd see in a museum exhibit about early photography. Both were pointed directly at the gate, and as we passed beneath them, I heard a mechanical whir, like gears turning. The gate itself stood open, just 2 iron posts really, no actual barrier, but there was a chain stretched across the ground, maybe 6 inches high, the kind that wouldn't stop anyone who really wanted to enter but served as a psychological boundary. The chain was red. Everything else at the retreat was white or gray, but that chain was the color of fresh blood. We didn't speak until we'd driven another 5 miles, until the retreat had long disappeared behind us, and the sun had started its descent toward the horizon, painting the rocks the same color as that chain. What the fuck was that? My roommate's girlfriend finally asked, but nobody answered because none of us knew. That night, at the motel 30 miles down the highway, I kept thinking about the notebook, about how the man had kept writing even after we'd reversed out of view. What could he possibly have been recording? And why did they need such detailed documentation of visitors who never even left their vehicles? I dreamed of the tower, of climbing it while the red light pulsed overhead. In the dream, I reached the top and looked down to find the entire compound had filled with people, hundreds of them, all standing perfectly still, all looking up at me. When I woke, my roommate was sitting on the edge of his bed, phone pressed to his ear even though the screen was dark. "No signal," he said when he noticed me watching. I keep forgetting. But I'd heard him talking, low, urgent whispers in a language I couldn't identify. The second visit was my idea, though I couldn't have explained why even to myself. Something about the retreat had lodged in my mind like a splinter, working its way deeper every time I probed at it. We drove back 3 days later, all of us agreeing without quite agreeing, the decision forming in the silence between us like condensation on glass. This time, we saw them before we reached the gate. A work crew, maybe 10 men, doing something in the field beside the access road. They wore the same gray coveralls, moved with the same synchronized precision, digging or planting or harvesting. I couldn't tell which. What caught my attention was their spacing. Each man stood exactly the same distance from the next, forming a grid so perfect it looked computer-generated. One of them turned to watch as we passed. Just turned his head, body remaining motionless, neck rotating with mechanical smoothness. His eyes followed our car, but his expression never changed. No curiosity, no concern, just observation. I slowed down without meaning to, and that's when I saw what they were working on. Wooden stakes, driven into the ground at regular intervals, each one carved with the same symbols I'd seen on the staff. There were hundreds of them, maybe thousands, extending far back into the field until they became too small to see clearly. The work crew was adding more, expanding the grid outward. "Don't stop," my roommate said. "Please don't stop." But I had stopped. We sat there idling in the middle of the road while the grid grew before us, stake after stake driven home with the rhythm of a heartbeat. The sound of mallets striking wood echoed across the empty landscape, and I realized the strikes were synchronized, all 10 men hitting at exactly the same moment over and over, a percussion that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Something touched the back of my neck. Just a brush, light as breath, but cold. I jerked forward, heart hammering, and saw my roommate's girlfriend had leaned back in her seat, hands folded in her lap. She couldn't have reached me. "Did you?" I started to ask, but the red light on the tower began pulsing again, and this time it was brighter, more insistent. The work crew set down their tools in perfect unison and began walking toward us. I hit the gas, and we fled. The third time, I went alone. I told myself I needed closure, needed to understand what I'd seen, but the truth, The truth I couldn't admit even in the privacy of my own thoughts was that some part of me wanted to go back, needed to go back. The retreat had become magnetic, pulling at something deep in my chest, a hook buried behind my sternum. My roommate had become strange since that second visit. He'd started organizing his belongings in careful patterns, arranging his textbooks and clothes with the same geometric precision as those stakes in the field. His girlfriend had stopped coming to class. When I'd asked about her, he'd simply said she was resting, and the way he emphasized that word made me decide not to press further. So I drove out alone, on a Tuesday morning when the desert sun turned everything white and pitiless. The gate stood open as before, but this time there was no chain across the ground. The red boundary had been removed, or perhaps it had never existed at all. Memory, I was learning, could be an unreliable document. I parked just outside the property line and walked in. No alarm sounded, no red light pulsed. The compound sat beneath the climbing sun in absolute silence, buildings radiating heat in visible waves. I could see into some of the windows now. Simple rooms, each containing a cot, a small table, a chair. No decoration, no personal effects. The rooms looked identical, as if they'd been stamped out by the same machine. The tower drew me forward. Up close I could see the structure was older than I'd thought. Wood-weathered gray. The red light fixture bolted to the top with visible rust stains bleeding down the sides. A door stood open at its base, revealing a spiral staircase that disappeared into shadow. I climbed without questioning why, feet finding each step automatically, hand trailing along the wall. The interior surface felt wrong, too smooth, too cold, like touching the inside of a refrigerator. Symbols had been carved into the walls at regular intervals, the same patterns from the staff, from the stakes in the field. They seemed to pulse as I passed, though that could have been the effect of dim light filtering through gaps in the boards. At the top, a platform barely wide enough for 2 people. The bell mechanism sat at its center, but it wasn't a bell at all, just a speaker, industrial grade, the kind used for tornado warnings. The red light was mounted to a wooden post, its cord snaking down through a hole in the platform. From this height, I could see the entire compound, and finally understood its design. The buildings formed a pattern, a symbol larger than any single structure. I recognized it from somewhere. Not religious iconography, not exactly, but something older, something that existed in the gap between conscious thought and dreaming, the kind of shape you might draw without meaning to, doodling while your mind wandered elsewhere. The field extended beyond what I'd seen from the road. The stakes continued in their perfect grid for what looked like miles, growing so dense in some areas they formed solid walls of wood and symbol. And moving among them, barely visible in the distance, gray-clad figures continued their work, expanding the pattern outward toward some invisible boundary. I heard footsteps on the stairs below me. The ascent had taken me maybe 2 minutes. The descent, back down toward the waiting light, took much longer, or felt longer. Time had become elastic, stretching and compressing according to rules I didn't understand. Each step seemed to take me both closer to and further from the bottom, until I couldn't remember which direction I was moving. When I finally emerged, blinking against the sun, the man with the staff stood waiting. He held his notebook. No, a different notebook. This one with a blue cover, and gestured for me to approach. Up close, his face was deeply lined, each wrinkle precise as if carved with intention. His eyes were pale gray, nearly white, and they didn't quite focus on me so much as through me, seeing something behind or beyond. He opened the notebook and showed me a page. My name was written at the top, in handwriting that looked disturbingly like my own. Below it, dates and times. Every visit I'd made, every moment I'd spent observing the retreat. Below that, notes about my roommate, his girlfriend, even my class schedule from 3 semesters ago. The next page showed a photograph, taped in with yellowing adhesive. It was me, standing at the base of the tower, looking up. The angle suggested it had been taken from above, from the platform I'd just left. But I'd been alone up there, completely alone. The man flipped to the next page, and my breath caught. A diagram, technical and detailed, showing the compound's layout from above. The building pattern I'd just observed was labeled in small, careful letters. Phase 1. Beyond it, sketched in lighter pencil, additional structures extending outward, growing like fractals, each iteration more complex than the last. At the center of it all, a small X marked my current position. Other symbols surrounded the diagram, calculations, measurements, notes in that same too familiar handwriting. And at the bottom of the page, a single sentence that made my skin grow cold. Subject integration proceeding as projected. He closed the notebook and pointed back toward the gate. Not a threat, not aggressive. Just a simple indication that my time was up, that the data collection phase had concluded, that whatever came next would proceed without my conscious participation. I walked back to my car on legs that felt borrowed, operating my body from a great distance. The gate remained open. The chain lay coiled beside one of the posts, waiting to be replaced, or perhaps it had always been there, and I simply hadn't noticed. As I drove away, I checked the rearview mirror. The man stood at the gate, watching. Behind him, the work crew had emerged from the fields, forming their precise lines, beginning their measured walk back toward the buildings. In perfect synchronization, they all stopped and turned toward my departing vehicle, and raised their hands in greeting. That was 6 weeks ago. Since then, I've noticed things, small things, the way my own belongings have begun organizing themselves into patterns while I sleep. The way I sometimes find myself standing perfectly still, staring at nothing, minutes or hours passing without awareness. The way certain words feel wrong in my mouth, as if my tongue has forgotten their shape. My roommate dropped out last week. He left a note saying he'd found his calling, that he was going somewhere he truly belonged. His girlfriend's parents filed a missing person report, but the police found nothing useful. Just an empty apartment, everything arranged in careful geometric patterns, and a spiral notebook on the desk filled with page after page of symbols. I dream about the tower every night now. In the dreams, I'm adding stakes to the field, hammer striking wood in rhythm with hundreds of others. The pattern grows beneath our hands, expanding outward, reaching toward the highway, toward the cities beyond. We're building something vast and ancient, something that existed long before we arrived, and will continue long after we're gone. Sometimes, in those quiet moments between waking and sleep, I can feel the pull of the retreat. It calls to me in a language older than words, promising belonging, promising purpose, promising an end to questions I no longer remember asking. Last night, I found a notebook in my backpack. Marbled cover, spiral bound, exactly like the ones at the retreat. The first page contains my name, written in my own hand, followed by a single sentence. Volunteer return anticipated. Below it, today's date. The highway stretches before me now, red rocks rising on either side, shadows falling at impossible angles. I can see the turnoff ahead, the access road winding into the desert. My hands are steady on the wheel. My breathing is calm. I'm not frightened anymore. Fear requires uncertainty, and I understand now with perfect clarity that this was always where I was heading. The only question I have left, the only uncertainty that remains, is whether I'm driving there because I want to, or because something in my mind has already been rewritten, reconfigured to bring me back. Whether the choice is mine, or if choice itself is just another pattern, another stake driven into ground that was claimed long before I ever arrived. The red chain lies coiled beside the gate, waiting. The tower stands against the sky, patient and knowing, and somewhere in the compound, in one of those identical rooms, a cot has been prepared, a table set, a chair positioned at exactly the right distance from the wall. My name is already in the notebook. My space has been measured and marked. The pattern continues to grow, and I'm become a part of it, another coordinate in a grid too vast to comprehend. The bell will sound when I arrive. The red light will pulse in greeting. The workers will form their lines and guide me to my place among them. And I will take up my hammer and stake and join the work that never ends, expanding outward toward a boundary I can almost see, building something that has no name in any language I remember speaking. The road bends. The retreat appears, and I complete the turn without slowing, because some migrations are written in ink that never fades. and some patterns once seen can never be unseen. Story 10. The gap in the chain link fence was smaller than it had looked from the road. I went through sideways, feeling the jagged metal catch on my jacket, and landed awkwardly on the other side where weeds had pushed through cracked asphalt. The Danvers State Hospital loomed ahead, its Gothic towers black against the October sky. They'd gutted most of the complex years ago, turned it into condos of all things. But this wing, tucked behind overgrown maples and a crumbling stone wall, had been left to rot. Garrett came through the fence next, his camera bag scraping against the metal with a sound that made my teeth ache. Then Tobias, moving with that careful deliberation he brought to everything, as if the world might shatter if he stepped too hard. "We've got maybe 2 hours before sunset," Garrett said, already adjusting his lens settings. He photographed abandoned places the way some people collected stamps, and he'd been talking about Danvers for months. The asylum where they'd pioneered the prefrontal lobotomy, where patients had been stacked in hallways when the wards overflowed, where the tunnels beneath the building supposedly ran for miles, connecting treatment rooms and morgues and God knew what else. I wasn't sure what I was collecting. Moments, maybe. Proof that I could still feel something sharp enough to cut through the numbness that had settled over my life like dust. Urban exploration gave me that. The spike of adrenaline when you slip past a barrier that says, "Keep out." The electric awareness that you're somewhere you shouldn't be, seeing things meant to be forgotten. We found the entrance around the east side, where weather and vandals had pried open a boarded window. The wood came away easily, almost welcoming. Inside, the smell hit first. Mildew and bird droppings and something metallic underneath, like old pennies left in water. The afternoon light slanted through broken windows, throwing bars of gold across a corridor that stretched into shadow. "Jesus," Tobias whispered, and his voice did something strange in that space. Got swallowed up and spat back slightly wrong, like the building was learning how to mimic human speech. The hallway was wide enough for gurneys to pass each other. Arched ceilings spoke to an era when even institutions for the mad aspired to grandeur. Doors hung open on rusted hinges, revealing rooms where metal bed frames stood skeletal against water-stained walls. Papers littered the floor. Admission forms, treatment schedules, something that might have been a patient roster from 1967. Names crossed out, dates circled in red. We moved deeper, our footsteps crunching on fallen plaster and broken glass. Garrett stopped every few yards to photograph a particularly evocative detail. A wheelchair folded in a corner, its leather seat cracked and peeling. A medicine cabinet with its door ajar, empty bottles still lined up inside. A tray of surgical instruments someone had left on a windowsill, the metal gone orange with rust, but the shape still unmistakable. In what must have been a common room, we found the therapy equipment. Occupational therapy, the plaques on the wall announced, as if teaching basket weaving to the profoundly disturbed was a badge of progressive treatment. Wooden looms stood in rows, their threads long since rotted away. Paint sets with colors dried to husks. A potter's wheel thick with dust. And on every wall those goddamn motivational posters from the 70s. Faded images of sunrises and soaring eagles, with slogans about perseverance and inner strength that must have seemed like mockery to anyone locked in this place. "Look at this," Tobias said, crouching near an overturned file cabinet. Papers had spilled across the floor and he was sorting through them with careful fingers. Patient files, hundreds of them. I knelt beside him, reading fragments. Diagnoses that ranged from the specific to the absurdly vague. Schizophrenia, melancholia, acute mania, moral insanity. Treatment notes written in cramped handwriting, describing ice baths and insulin shock and electroconvulsive therapy, administered without anesthesia. One file included a photograph. A woman with empty eyes staring at the camera, her hospital gown hanging loose on a frame gone skeletal with medication and despair. Something about that photograph made my throat tight. The way she looked at the camera but also through it, as if she could see us here in the future, pawing through the wreckage of her suffering for the thrill of it. I stood up too quickly, and the room tilted slightly before settling. Garrett was already moving on, drawn by the architectural bones of the place, the way light and shadow transformed decay into something almost beautiful through his viewfinder. We followed him down another corridor, this one darker, farther from the windows. The plaster had fallen away in large sections here, exposing the lath beneath like ribs through rotted flesh. We'd been inside maybe half an hour when I heard it. At first I thought it was water dripping somewhere, a steady rhythmic sound echoing through the empty spaces. But it was too regular, too purposeful. It was coming from the corridor we just left, back toward the common room with its abandoned therapy equipment. Tap, tap, tap. Garrett heard it too. He stopped mid-frame, his finger frozen over the shutter button. We stood there listening, and the sound continued, unhurried and deliberate. Something moving through the building with the confidence of ownership. Security? Tobias whispered. It was possible. These places sometimes had private security, local companies paid to do periodic sweeps, more to satisfy insurance requirements than from any real belief they could keep people out. But security guards used flashlights. They called out warnings, wanting you to leave without confrontation, wanting to avoid the paperwork of an actual arrest. This wasn't that. The light appeared at the far end of the corridor, maybe 40 yards away. Not the wavering circle of a handheld flashlight, but something larger, more diffuse. A cone of illumination that swept slowly from wall to wall as it advanced. Behind it, the tapping continued, steady and strange. Not footsteps exactly. Something harder, more metallic. And underneath that, almost subliminal, a sound I couldn't immediately place. A faint jingling, like keys on a ring. Or links of chains sliding against each other. We didn't discuss it. Garrett killed his camera, Tobias grabbed my arm, and we moved, not running. Running would make noise, would give away our panic. But walking quickly, keeping to the shadows where the afternoon light didn't reach. There was a stairwell ahead, a dark mouth opening in the wall, and we took it without hesitation. The stairs went up into deeper darkness. No windows here, just the ghost memory of light from below. We climbed by feel, hands on the damp walls, feet finding each step by instinct. 2 flights, maybe 3. My breath came hard and my pulse hammered in my ears, so loud I was sure whatever was down there could hear it. At the top, a landing, and off the landing, a narrow space. Not quite a room, more like an architectural afterthought, the kind of dead space that accumulates in old buildings where the angles don't quite meet. We pressed into it, the 3 of us packed together like children playing hide and seek, and tried not to breathe. The light came up the stairs slowly, through the narrow gap between the stairwell wall and the door frame. I could see it painting the walls, that strange diffuse glow that was too steady to be a flashlight, too focused to be anything natural. It moved with mechanical precision, sweeping from side to side as if searching, as if whatever carried it knew exactly how to eliminate blind spots and corners where someone might hide. The tapping grew louder, closer, and with it, that jingling sound, now clear enough to identify. Metal links, definitely, sliding against each other with each step. Not keys, a chain, or a collar. My mind, desperate for rational explanation, offered up images of a security guard with a dog, some trained animal taught to sweep buildings for intruders. But dogs didn't move like that, didn't advance with that measured mechanical patience. And dogs made sounds, panting, the click of claws on tile, the occasional whine or growl. This made only that tapping and the slide of chain links, and it was climbing the stairs toward us. The light reached the landing. It paused there, the cone of illumination washing over the walls, and for a moment I was certain it would swing toward our hiding place, would pin us like insects to a board, and whatever was behind that light would do. What? What did it want? What happened to trespassers when the thing patrolling the ruins finally caught them? The light held steady, pointed away from us, and I could see now that it wasn't a flashlight at all. It was too large, too powerful. A spotlight maybe, or one of those portable work lights contractors use, mounted on something that held it steady. But there was no generator hum, no electrical buzz, just silence behind the light, a silence so complete it felt like a physical presence. Then, slowly, the light began to move. Not toward us, past us. It swung to the left, away from our hiding place, painting the wall opposite with that cold, searching glow. It lingered there for what felt like minutes but was probably seconds. Then it withdrew, back down the stairs, taking that methodical tapping and the chain jingle with it. We stayed frozen. Tobias's hand was clamped on my wrist so hard I'd lost feeling in my fingers. But I didn't dare move to adjust his grip. Garrett's breathing had gone shallow and rapid beside me, on the edge of hyperventilation. I wanted to tell him to slow down, to breathe deeper, but opening my mouth felt like an invitation to disaster. The light descended the stairs. We watched it go, watched the glow fade from the landing, listened to the tapping recede. But it didn't leave the building. It moved back down the corridor we'd come from, that steady sweep of illumination marking its progress. Searching, always searching. How long we stood there, I couldn't say. Long enough for my legs to cramp, for the sweat on my back to dry and go cold. Long enough for the light to make another pass through the lower corridor, then another, each time a little slower, a little more thorough. Long enough for me to realize something that made my skin prickle. The light had stopped directly at the place where we'd been hiding. It had paused there, had held position for those long seconds, sweeping back and forth across the landing. It had been exactly where we were crouched in the dark. It had known, or something had known, had counted us, just as surely as if we'd stepped into the light and announced ourselves. But it had moved on, had let us be, had pretended, perhaps, that we weren't there. When the light finally retreated far enough that we could no longer see it, could only hear the faint tapping from some distant wing of the hospital. Garrett was the first to move. He extracted himself from our hiding place with exaggerated care, as if sudden movement might summon the light back. "We need to leave," he said. And his voice was different now, stripped of the casual confidence that had carried him through dozens of urban exploration trips. This was raw fear, the kind that bypasses the thinking brain and goes straight to the animal core that knows when it's being hunted. But leaving meant going back down those stairs, meant returning to the corridors where that light was still moving, still searching. The windows we'd climbed through were on the ground floor, a lifetime away through the dark. Tobias had his phone out, the screen glow making his face look corpse pale in the gloom. "No signal," he said. "I can't even... there's nothing." Of course there wasn't. The building's old bones, the metal infrastructure, whatever frequencies still lingered in places where they'd done electroshock therapy, it all conspired to create dead zones where modern technology failed. We were cut off, stranded in the dark with something that knew we were here but chose, for its own unknowable reasons, to let us remain. Or was waiting. Waiting for what? I tried to think rationally, to line up the facts in some kind of order that made sense. We'd entered an abandoned building. Someone, something else was here too, conducting some kind of systematic patrol. Security probably. Had to be security. Some private outfit hired to keep vandals and curious teenagers out of what was left of Danvers. But security guards didn't act like this. Didn't move with that mechanical precision. Didn't use spotlights powerful enough to light up a construction site. Didn't bring... what? Dogs? Something else? And they didn't know exactly where you were hiding. Didn't stop at the precise location where you crouched in the dark, and then move on as if granting you a reprieve. "There has to be another way out," I said, more to hear a human voice, my own voice, than because I believed it. But maybe it was true. These old institutions always had fire escapes, emergency exits, service entrances meant for deliveries and discreet removal of the dead. If we could find one on this floor, we could avoid the ground-level corridors entirely. We moved down the hallway, away from the stairs, feeling our way in darkness that grew thicker as we left what little light filtered up from below. The walls here were in worse shape, the plaster completely gone in places, exposing brick underneath. Sometimes my hand touched something that wasn't brick. Metal fixtures, pipes, electrical conduits that had been ripped open and stripped for copper years ago. Room after room opened off the corridor. We checked each one, looking for windows large enough to climb through, for fire escapes that might still be intact. But the windows were either too small or too high, and the fire escapes we did find had collapsed or been removed, leaving only rust-stained holes in the wall where the bolts had pulled free. The light reappeared without warning. One moment we were feeling our way through darkness, and the next that cold glow was sweeping up from the floor below, illuminating the corridor ahead in stark relief. We'd wandered too far, had doubled back without realizing it, and now we were caught between the light and whatever dead end waited at the hallway's terminus. There was no time for debate. I grabbed the nearest doorknob. Miraculously it turned, and we tumbled into the room beyond, pulling the door closed behind us. This had been an office once. A desk stood against one wall, its surface covered with papers that had fused together with age and moisture into a single papery mass. File cabinets lined another wall. A chair, overturned, and on the floor, scattered like the pieces of a puzzle someone had abandoned mid-assembly, hundreds of index cards covered in handwriting, treatment notes, patient observations, the daily minutiae of institutional life, recorded in blue ink that had faded to ghost pale. Patient C refused breakfast. Patient L demonstrated improvement in group therapy. Patient B found unresponsive in room 214, transferred to medical wing. The light was in the corridor outside now. I could see it through the gap beneath the door, that telltale glow sweeping back and forth, accompanied by the tapping and the chain jingle. It was moving more slowly now, taking its time, and I had the sudden irrational certainty that it was reading the building somehow, sensing the heat of our bodies through the walls, the carbon dioxide of our breath, the electromagnetic signatures of our racing hearts. Garrett had backed against the far wall, his camera forgotten, both hands pressed over his mouth as if he could physically hold in any sound that might escape. Tobias was beside me, near the door, his face pressed close to the frame, trying to see out without being seen. The light stopped. It was directly outside our door. I could see the glow intensify, could see shadows sharpen as the source drew closer. The tapping had ceased, but the chain jingle continued, a slow, deliberate sound, as if something was testing the weight of its restraint, measuring how much slack remained. Then, very softly, something touched the other side of the door. I felt it more than heard it. A vibration through the wood, the pressure of something on the other side, right at my eye level. Not a hand. The touch was too broad, too heavy, like someone had pressed their full weight against the door, leaning in, listening. My lungs burned. I'd been holding my breath without realizing it, and now I couldn't inhale without making sound. The room seemed to contract around me, the walls pressing in, the air gone thick and hard to draw. The thing on the other side of the door stayed there for a count of 10, 20, 30 heartbeats while I stood paralyzed, certain that at any moment the knob would turn, the door would swing open, and whatever was behind that light would finally reveal itself. But the door didn't open. The pressure against the wood eased. The light withdrew, sliding away down the corridor with that same methodical sweep. The tapping resumed, growing fainter as whatever carried the light moved on to search other rooms, other corners, other shadows where trespassers might hide. When I finally allowed myself to breathe, the air tasted like rot and old paper and something else, something chemical and bitter that caught in the back of my throat. "It's checking the rooms," Tobias said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's going to come back. It's going to open this door." He was right. Whatever systematic patrol this thing was conducting, it would eventually return to the rooms it had skipped, would eventually try the doors it had only pressed against. We couldn't stay here, but we couldn't leave without walking directly into that searching light. Unless... I looked around the office again, more carefully this time. Standard institutional architecture, solid walls, solid ceiling, tile floor. But in the corner, partially hidden behind an overturned file cabinet, I could see a darker square. A vent. Large enough for air circulation, for the industrial-sized ducts that had carried heat and air conditioning through the sprawling complex. Large enough, maybe, for a person. Getting the grill off was harder than I expected. The screws had rusted solid. But desperation makes you strong, and between the three of us we managed to work it loose. The duct behind was dark and narrow, but it did extend beyond the wall, disappearing into the building's hidden infrastructure. Garrett went first, wriggling into the opening with his camera bag clutched to his chest. I heard him grunting as he pulled himself forward, heard the metallic echo of his progress. Then Tobias, moving with that same careful deliberation, disappearing into the dark. I was about to follow when I heard it again, the tapping, closer now, coming back. I dove into the duct, pulling myself forward with my elbows, feeling the metal cold against my chest. Behind me, the light appeared in the office doorway. I could see it reflected in the metal around me, see shadows leap and dance as the source swept the room. The door opened. I know it did because I heard the hinges creak, heard that soft tapping enter the space I'd occupied seconds before. The light flooded the duct, washing over my legs, my back, painting everything in that cold, unforgiving glow, but it didn't pursue. The light held steady for a moment, then withdrew. The door closed softly, almost gently, and the tapping moved on. It had seen me. Had to have seen me. But once again, it chose to let me go. The ducts were a nightmare, a maze of turns and branches and dead ends that forced us to backtrack repeatedly. In places the metal had corroded through, leaving gaps where we could glimpse the rooms below, could see more abandoned equipment, more scattered papers, more evidence of lives interrupted and broken. In other places the ducts were so narrow we had to exhale completely to squeeze through, the metal scraping against ribs and spine. But eventually, after what felt like hours, we saw daylight. A vent opening onto the building's exterior, the grill long since fallen away. We emerged like miners surfacing after a cave-in, dirty and scraped and shaking with adrenaline crash. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and red. We'd been inside longer than I thought, long enough for the October afternoon to bleed into evening, long enough for the temperature to drop and our breath to steam in the cooling air. We didn't speak as we made our way back to the fence, back to the car waiting on the access road. What was there to say? That we'd been chased through an abandoned building by something with a spotlight and a chain? That it had known exactly where we were hiding but had chosen, repeatedly, to let us escape? That it had seemed less like a guard protecting the property and more like a shepherd, herding us gently but firmly toward some destination only it understood? It was only later, after we'd driven back to the city, after we'd parted ways with promises to delete any photos and never speak of this again, that I allowed myself to consider the alternative explanation. What if we hadn't escaped at all? What if that careful herding had been deliberate, had been guiding us exactly where we needed to go? The vent had been conveniently accessible. The ducts had led, despite all their branches and dead ends, to that opening. We'd emerged exactly where we needed to be to reach the fence, the car, the road home, as if something had been showing us the way out, as if something had been protecting us from what might happen if we stayed too long, went too deep, saw too much of what Danvers still contained in its rotting heart. I checked the news sometimes, looking for stories about Danvers, about accidents at the complex, about other urban explorers who slipped through the fence and never came back out. But there's nothing. Just the occasional piece about the condo development, about the efforts to preserve what little remains of the original hospital. And late at night, when sleep won't come and my mind drifts back to that afternoon, I think about the light, the tapping, the chain jingle that seemed almost like a leash, as if something was being kept in check, restrained from doing what it wanted to do. I think about how it knew where we were, always, how it counted us in the darkness without needing to see. And I think about that final moment in the office, when the light fell on me in the duct and then withdrew, when the door closed softly and the tapping moved on. There was something almost gentle about it, something that felt less like a threat and more like a warning. Some places want to be watched, need to be watched. And when you slip past the barriers they've erected, when you go where you're not supposed to go and see what you're not supposed to see, something has to make a choice. Chase you out, with all the noise and chaos that implies, or guide you carefully to the exit, shepherd you back to the world outside, let you leave with the understanding that you've been granted a mercy you didn't earn, that you've been counted, cataloged and, for reasons you'll never understand, allowed to go. I haven't been back to Danvers, haven't gone urban exploring at all since that October afternoon. Garrett says he's done too, though I think he still looks at his photos sometimes, the ones he took before we heard the tapping. Tobias moved to the West Coast, got a job in tech, sends the occasional text to let me know he's okay. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I hear it. That soft, methodical tapping, that chain jingle. And I know that somewhere, in the ruins of places meant to be forgotten, something is still walking, still counting, still watching over spaces that hold too much pain, too much memory, too much of what we tried to throw away but could never quite destroy. And I know that if I ever go back, if I ever slip through another fence and step into another abandoned building, it will be waiting, counting, deciding whether to let me leave, or whether this time I've seen too much. New Story 11. The air inside the veterinary laboratory smelled wrong from the moment we descended the concrete stairs. Not the expected mustiness of abandonment, but something wetter, colder, like the breath of a freezer that's been unplugged for days but still clings to the memory of ice. My camera bag felt heavier with each step down, the fluorescent fixtures overhead flickering in sequences that seemed almost deliberate, as if the building itself was deciding whether to let us see. I'd been filming abandoned medical facilities for 3 years, ever since my documentary on forgotten healthcare infrastructure gained traction at a regional film festival. The veterinary lab on the outskirts of St. Louis had appeared in my research like a footnote begging to be explored. Decommissioned in the late 90s, partially stripped for salvage, then left to the slow rot of Midwestern humidity and bureaucratic indifference. The necropsy sector, according to the county records I'd obtained, had been sealed since closure. No vandalism, no urban exploration blogs, nothing. A perfect, pristine capsule of institutional decay. The security guard who'd let me in, a barrel-chested man whose jacket still carried the faint chemical smell of dry cleaning, had been unexpectedly cooperative. He'd made me sign a liability waiver with his flashlight wedged under his arm, barely glancing at my credentials before gesturing toward the basement access. His only stipulation was that I keep my phone on, volume up, in case he needed to reach me. The building's main power was shut off, he'd explained, but the emergency lighting still functioned on some kind of backup system that the county hadn't bothered to disconnect. The necropsy suite revealed itself in stages as my eyes adjusted. Stainless steel examination tables dominated the center of the room, their surfaces dulled by a patina that caught the emergency lights in muted brownish streaks. I'd seen rust before, filmed it, cataloged its textures, but these stains seemed too organic, too deliberately placed in the drainage channels and around the bolt holes. They looked less like oxidation and more like something had been absorbed into the metal itself. I set up my camera on the tripod, framing a wide shot that captured the rows of horizontal drawer cabinets lining the far wall. Each drawer bore a small brass tag, most of them tarnished beyond legibility. The air felt thicker here, pressing against my eardrums in a way that made me want to yawn, to equalize some pressure that couldn't quite be named. I started filming, letting the camera roll on the static tableau while I moved to check the lighting angles. That's when the faucet began. It was a gooseneck fixture mounted on the wall above one of the steel tables, the kind designed for washing down surfaces or rinsing instruments. The tremor started small, a barely perceptible vibration that I might have dismissed as my own movement transmitted through the floor. But it grew, becoming a rhythmic shudder that made the curved neck of the faucet sway like a snake testing the air. The sound that accompanied it was worse than the motion, a metallic grinding, bone-deep and resonant, as if someone was attempting to force a valve that had long since fused shut. I stopped moving. The camera continued recording, its lens trained on the cabinets, missing the faucet entirely. The vibration spread, traveling through the plumbing or the walls or perhaps through something more fundamental. The steel trays on the nearest table began to hum, their edges chattering against each other in a cascade of overlapping frequencies. The horizontal drawers joined the chorus, their rails singing at a pitch that made my molars ache and my vision blur at the edges. I should have grabbed my equipment and left. That would have been the rational response, the one that my 3 years of filming derelict buildings had trained into me. Instead, I found myself stepping closer to the faucet, watching the way its trembling seemed to follow a pattern. 3 sharp shudders, a pause, 3 more, another pause. Like someone trying the handle over and over, expecting different results. The emergency lights dimmed, brightened, dimmed again. In those moments of near darkness, I thought I saw moisture beading at the faucet's spout, though when the light returned, the metal was dry. My phone buzzed in my pocket. The security guard's number appeared on the screen, but when I answered, I heard only the hollow sound of an open line, empty of breath or voice. I called out a greeting, then another. Nothing. I ended the call and immediately tried redialing, but the number rang endlessly, never connecting. The faucet had stopped vibrating. The sudden silence felt louder than the noise had been, a vacuum that my ears tried to fill with the sound of my own pulse. I looked at my camera, still recording, and realized with a creeping unease that I should check the playback, verify that the sounds had been captured and weren't just some auditory hallucination brought on by the basement's oppressive atmosphere. I approached the camera, pressed the playback button. The footage showed the cabinets, exactly as I'd framed them. The timestamp ticked forward, 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes. But there was no sound, no vibration, no metallic singing, not even the ambient noise of the building settling or my own breathing. Just silence, pure and absolute, beneath footage that should have captured everything. I ran the recording back again, watching my own figure enter the frame in reverse as I'd moved to investigate the faucet. On playback, I saw myself stop, turn, and stare at something off camera. My posture on the recording suggested tension, alertness, but the footage itself showed nothing. Just me, frozen, looking at empty space while the timestamp continued its steady progression. The temperature in the room had dropped. I could see my breath now, small clouds that dissipated too quickly, as if the air was hungry for moisture. The brownish stains on the steel tables seemed darker, wetter, though when I reached out to touch one, my finger came away clean and dry. The discrepancy lodged in my mind like a splinter. What I saw and what I felt refusing to align. I began photographing the drawers, working methodically to override the growing sense that I should not be here, that the building was tolerating my presence rather than simply containing it. Each drawer I documented seemed to pull my attention toward it, as if the cabinets themselves were insisting on being seen, cataloged, remembered. Some of the brass tags bore traces of engraving, partial words, fragments of dates. One read, "Eerie 1997, and another showed only roof access, before the rest had corroded away. Roof access. The guard had mentioned something about the roof. My memory of his exact words had already started to blur, the way details do when you're focused on other things. Something about an intern, something about an accident. I pulled out my phone to check if I'd made any notes during our initial conversation, but my note-taking app showed only a blank page with today's date. No entries, no reminders, just the blinking cursor waiting for input I couldn't remember withholding. The faucet began vibrating again, but this time the sound was different, less like mechanical resistance and more like respiration, a wet, labored breathing that seemed to come from the pipes themselves. I grabbed my camera, abandoning the tripod, and pointed it directly at the fixture. Through the viewfinder, the faucet appeared normal, motionless, but the sound continued, growing louder, filling the room until I could feel it vibrating in my chest cavity. I documented everything with frantic efficiency. The stains, the drawers, the way the light seemed to pool in corners that shouldn't have been darker than anywhere else. My rational mind, the part trained in composition and lighting and narrative structure, kept insisting that there had to be an explanation. Old pipes, pressure differentials, the acoustics of a sealed basement room. But underneath that rationality, something more primitive understood that explanations were just stories we tell ourselves to make peace with things that resist explanation. A door I hadn't noticed before stood at the far end of the room, partially hidden behind a rolling equipment rack. The sign above it read, Roof access, authorized personnel only, in faded red letters. I approached it slowly, my camera still recording, and noticed that the handle looked newer than everything else in the room. Recently replaced, perhaps, or simply better maintained. There were scratches around the lock, bright silver gouges in the dull brass, as if someone had tried to force it open repeatedly. I tried the handle. It turned easily, too easily, and the door swung inward on hinges that made no sound at all. Beyond it, a narrow stairwell climbed upward into darkness that the emergency lighting didn't penetrate. Cold air flowed down from above, carrying with it that same freezer melt smell I'd noticed when first descending to the necropsy level. My phone buzzed again, this time a text from the security guard. Time to leave. I texted back. 5 more minutes? The response came immediately. No, now. Don't use the roof stairs. I stared at the message, then at the stairwell. I hadn't mentioned the stairs, hadn't sent him any photos or descriptions of what I'd found. The only way he could know I was near the roof access was if he was watching on security cameras. But the building's power was off, the surveillance system long since deactivated. Unless it wasn't. I backed away from the door, and it swung shut on its own with a soft click that sounded too deliberate, too final. The faucet had stopped vibrating again. The room had returned to that oppressive silence, but now it felt expectant, as if the building was waiting to see what I would do next. I packed my equipment with hands that had started to shake, trying to ignore the way the drawer cabinet seemed to have shifted position slightly, their arrangement no longer quite matching my memory of when I'd entered. The brownish stains on the tables had spread during my investigation, creeping along the drainage channels in patterns that suggested flow rather than simple oxidation. As I mounted the stairs back to ground level, I counted the steps. 13 down had become 15 going up. I counted twice more, certain I'd miscounted. But the number remained wrong. Impossible. A small tear in the fabric of what should have been simple geometry. The security guard was waiting in the lobby, his expression neutral, but his posture suggesting he'd been standing there for longer than the few minutes since his text. He took my signed waiver and tore it in half without looking at it. "The pipes in this block bleed air when it gets cold," he said, his tone conversational, rehearsed. "Creates all kinds of noise. Scares the hell out of people who don't know better." I nodded, but I was watching his hands. They trembled slightly and his knuckles bore fresh scratches, the kind you get from handling sharp metal in tight spaces. "An intern got hurt on the roof years back," he continued, still not meeting my eyes. "Before my time. County sealed the whole upper section after that. Liability thing." "What happened to them?" I asked. "The intern?" He finally looked at me and his eyes held something I couldn't name. Not quite fear, not quite complicity, but something in between. "Nobody really knows. The reports got sealed along with the section. But every winter, when the temperature drops and those pipes start up, I do a check of the building. Protocol." He walked me to my car, his presence less like an escort and more like someone making sure I actually left. Before I got in, he tapped the hood twice, a gesture that seemed both friendly and final. "You get what you needed?" he asked. I thought about my footage, the sounds that weren't there, the movement my camera hadn't captured, the stairs that couldn't count properly. "I'm not sure yet." "Probably for the best," he said, already turning back toward the building. "Some places don't like being remembered too clearly. I've reviewed the footage 17 times since that afternoon. Each viewing reveals new details I'm certain weren't there before. Shadows that move counter to the emergency lights, reflections in the steel that show empty rooms I never entered, and in one frame, just one, the clear image of condensation on the inside of a drawer cabinet, as if something inside had been breathing. The brownish stains in my footage have continued to spread, even in the recorded video, advancing along the steel surfaces in slow motion between each time I press play. I've checked the file's metadata, looked for corruption or manipulation, but the code shows only the original recording from that day. Unedited, unaltered, impossible. I've started keeping detailed logs of the footage's changes, documenting each new detail as it appears. The rational part of my mind insists this is some technical glitch, a quirk of the camera's memory card or compression artifacts manifesting in unusual ways. But I know with a certainty that bypasses reason entirely, that the building isn't finished with me yet. Last night I woke to the sound of water running somewhere in my apartment. Every faucet was dry, every pipe silent. But the sound continued, that distinctive resonance of a gooseneck fixture, vibrating against a valve that refuses to turn. I stood in my kitchen for 20 minutes, listening until it finally stopped. This morning I found moisture beaded on my bathroom mirror, arranged in patterns that looked almost like text, almost like a message, before evaporating in the growing daylight. I've been staring at the photograph I took of it, trying to decode what the condensation might have been trying to say, but the shapes resist interpretation, hovering between meaning and randomness. The security guard hasn't answered any of my calls. The county records office insists there's no documentation of an intern incident at the facility, no sealed reports, no liability cases. According to their files, the building's roof access has been permanently welded shut since 1984, more than a decade before the facility even closed. But I remember that door. Remember it opening. Remember the cold air flowing down from above and the scratches around the lock, bright and fresh as wounds that refuse to heal. I've decided to go back, not to film this time, but to understand. The building showed me something that day, revealed a crack between what is and what should be possible. I need to know if I brought something back with me, or if I left something of myself behind in that necropsy suite, trapped in the space between the footage that records and the reality that resists recording. My camera bag sits by the door, already packed. The battery is fully charged. The memory card is empty, waiting. Outside, the temperature is dropping toward another Missouri winter, and somewhere in St. Louis, in a decommissioned veterinary laboratory, pipes are beginning to bleed air through valves that no longer turn. And I can hear them from here, vibrating in perfect rhythm with my pulse, calling me back to finish documenting something that may not want to remain forgotten, or may already be documenting me.